Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still remember the exact afternoon sky when I decided to hike deeper into the Garfield Forest Preserve. It was 1993. And I was living near Maplewood, Iowa. I had heard the rumors for years, whispers about some strange presence lurking out there, something that no one had ever managed to photograph or prove. I'd always thought it was local folklore, just something drunk hunters would mention to spook each other. But I was bored with my life at the time, and I guess I needed something that felt like an adventure. So I strapped on my old boots, grabbed my worn-out backpack, and headed into the woods with that slight tension in my chest you get when you're pushing yourself into unfamiliar territory. The Garfield Forest Preserve isn't the kind of place where people picnic on weekends. It's a dense patch of old trees, thick underbrush, and barely maintained trails that even the locals don't bother exploring. I remember how quiet it felt that morning, except for the rustle of rodents in the leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. There was a certain heaviness in the air, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. Still, nothing happened at first. I walked for a good hour, maybe more, and besides my own footsteps crunching the ground, it was just nature doing its thing. Eventually, I ran into two other people out there, which surprised me. They introduced themselves as Nalani and Alawami, fellow hikers, maybe thrill-seekers like me, though they looked more like weekend adventurers than anything. They were examining a broken branch that hung strangely over one of the lesser-known paths. It was thick, too thick to be snapped by normal wind. They joked about the so-called Garfield beast, laughing the way you do when you're not really taking something seriously. I remember grinning along with them, feeling relief at not being alone out there. For a moment, we were just three curious strangers swapping stories and wondering if the local legend was nothing more than a stupid rumor. Then we heard it. It was a low, guttural sound that seemed to roll through the forest. It wasn't a simple animal grunt. It had a depth to it, like a distorted growl or something dragging through its throat. I can't fully explain it, but it made every hair on my body stand up. The birds went silent. We all froze, looking at each other with that kind of silent question. Did you hear that too? Nalani's face went pale, and even though I'd just met her, I could tell she was scared. So was I. We tried to tell ourselves it was a deer or maybe a bear, but none of us bought that. Deer don't make that kind of noise. We decided to move forward cautiously, as if not wanting to admit we were rattled. I noticed that the woods had gotten oddly quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels darting around. Nothing. Just our footsteps and the sound of our breathing. We didn't talk much. Every step felt heavier, like something was pressing down on us. Then we heard the sound again, this time closer. It was like it was circling us, staying just out of sight. I looked around, but could only catch hints of movement, shadows shifting between trunks, leaves stirring in places they shouldn't. The trees were thick, the foliage dense, so it was easy to imagine things. Yet I know what I saw. A blur of something tall, something that moved on two legs, quietly vanishing behind a trunk, just as I tried to focus on it. I whispered for them to stay calm, though I was anything but calm myself. We checked our phones, but there was no reception. Figures, right? We were deep enough in that the signal just didn't exist. I started regretting coming out there, feeling stupid for thinking this would be some kind of exciting day. This wasn't exciting. It was terrifying. A few minutes later we noticed claw marks or deep scratches on some of the tree bark. They were high up, too high for any normal animal like a fox or coyote. The marks were deep and uneven, as if something very strong had raked its hand or paw across the trunk. Nalani tried to joke, saying maybe a black bear had gotten lost this far south, but her voice shook. None of us really believed it. We were dealing with something else, something that felt wrong. There's no other word for it, just wrong. We picked up our pace, not wanting to run, but not wanting to stick around either. The tension was so thick I could taste it. I heard snapping twigs behind us, then to our right, then silence again. It felt like being watched by a predator that was enjoying our panic. The forest floor was damp, and the air smelled of moss and rot, a smell that felt more and more oppressive as we continued. The growl came again, and it sounded frustrated, almost angry. I remember thinking, we need to get out of here now. We stumbled across a small, semi-hidden hollow in the side of a dirt bank. It was overgrown with shrubs and bushes, barely noticeable unless you were looking for cover. Without speaking, we all just kind of nodded and ducked inside, trying to catch our breath and calm down. It was cramped, smelled like wet leaves and old soil. The three of us huddled together, straining our ears to catch any sound outside. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, but was probably just a few minutes. Then we heard heavy footsteps approaching. They weren't human footsteps, too slow, too calculated. A branch snapped, and I felt my heart jump. The steps came closer and closer, then stopped right outside our hiding spot. We held our breath. I could hear Nalani's breathing through her nose, shallow and terrified. I was trying to keep myself from shaking. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whatever was out there could hear it. Then we heard a strange sniffing sound, like something was testing the air, and that same low growl, this time so close I could feel the vibration in my chest. I was sure that at any second something would yank us out of there. But then, nothing happened. The creature, I don't know what else to call it, just stopped making noise. After a few moments, the forest itself seemed to go quiet again. Not the eerie silence from before, but more like a normal stillness. We waited and waited, listening for any sign of movement. We heard a distant rustle, and then silence for good. After what felt like an eternity, we crawled out. My legs were stiff, and I felt like I'd just escaped a car accident. Everything looked the same, but somehow different. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, and it felt like the forest had somehow reset. The tension was gone, and the normal forest sounds gradually returned, like life was slowly hitting play again. We stood there, shaken and confused, unsure if we'd lost our minds, or if we really had just avoided something dangerous and unknown. We headed back the way we came, sticking closer to each other than before. As we got nearer to the edges of the preserve, our phones found a signal again. We called the park rangers and tried to explain what happened. Honestly, we just sounded like every other frightened hiker with a crazy story. They were polite, but clearly skeptical. Without any photos or hard evidence, what could they do? They said they'd keep an eye out, but I doubt they really believed us. We parted ways after reaching the main road. I never saw Nalani or Alawami again, but I think about them sometimes. I wonder if they ever told their friends what happened out there, or if they just tried to bury it in the back of their minds. As for me, I still can't explain it. I know what I felt. I know I heard something that seemed intelligent and powerful, something that was capable of messing with us, watching us, and then just leaving. To this day, I still don't know what lurks in Garfield Forest Preserve. I never went back. I have no clue if anyone else ever came forward with a similar story. It's just one of those experiences that doesn't have a neat ending. One day, I stepped into that old forest thinking I'd debunk a rumor or find nothing at all, and I came out shaken, convinced there's something out there that no one can really explain. Story 2. I still remember that night like it happened yesterday, even though it's been decades since then. Back in 1987, I was working as a nighttime security guard in Doverfield, Vermont. It was a small, quiet town where people usually kept to themselves. Around that time, I had a pretty simple routine: drive around the empty streets, check the local businesses, make sure no one was lurking around. Nothing ever really happened. At least, that's what I used to believe. On that particular night, I was feeling the cold more than usual. I recall wearing my thicker jacket, the one with the old patch on the elbow, and I had a thermos of coffee resting on the passenger seat. My route included passing by Elmshire Park, a place known for its tall trees and a calm lake. Usually it felt peaceful, even pleasant, but not that night. As I approached the park, something felt off. I picked up a strange metallic scent drifting in through my open window. It wasn't the smell of blood exactly, but something close, like rusted iron and damp earth mixed together. It made me uneasy enough that I slowed down without even thinking about it. The park was darker than usual. The moon was out, but the branches were so thick that the light barely made it through. I parked near the old wooden sign and stepped out with my flashlight. I remember the crunch of leaves under my boots sounded louder than normal, like my senses were suddenly sharper. I can't explain why I felt so on edge. Maybe it was just the smell getting into my head. As I walked deeper along the small path that led towards the lake, I noticed something wasn't right with the trees. One of the thick branches of a large oak was snapped clean off. I'm talking about a branch the size of my leg, broken like a twig. On the ground, the soil seemed torn up. There were deep impressions, almost like footprints, but they were way bigger than any person's and oddly shaped. They looked like someone tried to carve out footprints with a shovel, only there was a defined shape, like a heel and some kind of massive toe marks. It didn't match any animal I knew, and I'd grown up around those woods, so I was pretty familiar with local wildlife. Deer, bears, foxes, I'd seen plenty of those, but this was different. The smell got stronger as I moved closer to where these marks led, and there was this unsettling quiet all around. Even the crickets seemed to stop. I held my flashlight out in front of me, my heart pounding. Every step I took, I expected something to jump out. At one point, I caught a glimpse of what I thought was fur, dark, matted fur, clinging to some bark. It was high up on a tree trunk, at least 7 or 8 feet above the ground. I'm not a short guy, but I'd have to stretch like hell to reach that spot. Whatever left that fur was tall, really tall. Right then, I heard a crack, like a branch snapping under weight. I spun around, shining my flashlight towards the sound, but I only caught shifting shadows and branches swaying. My pulse was hammering in my ears. I remember whispering something to myself like, "What the hell?" I stepped backwards, and that's when I heard a low, deep grunt, more like a guttural sound. It didn't sound like a bear. It sounded almost human, but not quite. It had this heavy, wet quality, like someone trying to speak with a throat full of gravel. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I gripped my flashlight tighter and tried to steady my breathing. I called out, low and quiet, something along the lines of, "Who's there?" I don't know why I did that. Instinct, I guess. There was no reply, just the rustle of leaves and something moving quickly behind the thick underbrush. I thought maybe I saw a silhouette, huge shoulders, a head that seemed too broad, and a pair of eyes reflecting my flashlight's beam for just a split second. But it was too fast. It moved behind the trees and vanished into the darkness like it was nothing. I know how it sounds. If someone told me this story back then, I wouldn't have believed it. I'd have laughed it off. But I was there, and I've never been so certain that something was watching me, something not quite human. I tried to follow the direction of the noise, stepping carefully through the undergrowth, but I couldn't see a damn thing except the shapes of trees and shadows. My heart felt like it was in my throat. Every so often I'd catch another grunt or a heavy breathing sound, It always sounded one step ahead of me, moving just out of sight. At one point, I found these fresh marks on a tree trunk, long, deep scratch marks, as if something huge had dug massive claws or nails into the bark. They were parallel and so clean, like a big hand had raked across the trunk. I couldn't imagine a bear leaving marks like that, at least not in such a neat pattern. And these trees aren't soft. A human would need a hatchet to make gouges that deep. The smell, that metallic odor, got stronger the deeper I went. There was a thick tension in the air, something that made my stomach twist. I was shaking, not just from the cold. I remember glancing at my sidearm, considering whether I should draw it. But even if I did, what good would it do against something that could break thick branches like that? Then I heard the most unsettling thing, a kind of low growl followed by a heavy exhale, almost like a sigh, but powerful enough to rustle leaves. It sounded frustrated, angry, maybe even curious. I shone my flashlight frantically, but all I could see were blurred shapes. I aimed the beam higher, towards where I'd found that fur, and something moved again. I caught the shape of a broad shoulder, an arm longer than any humans I've seen, gripping a branch. The silhouette was so massive that it blocked out what little moonlight there was. Then, in a flash, it dropped down behind some bushes and out of sight. I should have turned and run right then, but part of me was stuck there, frozen, wanting to understand what the hell I was dealing with. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, so I started stepping back, not wanting to turn my back on it. I kept shining my flashlight around, scanning every tree, every thicket, waiting for it to come charging at me. If it had, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be here telling this story. But it never did. Instead, I started noticing the silence. The wind picked up a bit, and I could hear my own breathing echoing in my ears. I waited, hoping to catch another glimpse, maybe prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. But it was gone. The forest was quiet again, just distant rustling of leaves. The metallic smell began to fade. After standing there for what felt like forever, I finally convinced myself to leave. I hurried back to my patrol car, keeping my flashlight on the path behind me, as if something would come out of the dark and grab me. My heart was still pounding when I turned the ignition and got the hell out of there. I didn't tell anyone about it at first. Who would believe me? A giant figure, walking on two legs, tearing through trees and leaving strange footprints in the soil. They'd say I was drunk, or that I saw a bear and got spooked. But I know what I saw, or at least what I almost saw. I can't describe its face, because I never got a clear look, but those broad shoulders and long arms, that presence, it felt more real than any story I'd ever heard. In the following days, people around town started talking about weird noises and strange smells at night. Some mentioned odd footprints near the park's edge. A few even claimed to see a large shape moving through the trees. They swapped stories over drinks at the bar, and I mostly kept quiet, just listening. It was comforting in a twisted way to know I wasn't alone in this, that I wasn't imagining everything. But still, no one had solid evidence, just rumors and whispers. When a small group decided to go out at night and look for it, I joined them. Not because I was brave, but because I wanted to know I hadn't lost my mind. We went in with guns, flashlights, and a kind of nervous excitement. We found scratch marks, broken branches, and places where the soil was turned up. We smelled that same strange odor, but we never saw it. Just glimpses, maybe, shadows that seemed to dart away before we could point our lights. The tension was thick, and every little sound made us jump. Eventually we gave up and went back. No one said much afterward. I think they were scared too. I never had another encounter quite like that first night. I continued my rounds with a lot more caution, especially when I drove near Elmshire Park. But it never confronted me again. It was like some weird one-time glimpse into something I still can't explain. To this day, I can't say what it was. Some people call these things Bigfoot, some kind of undiscovered creature that hides in the deep woods. All I know is that what I experienced wasn't a normal animal. It was big, strong, and smart enough to stay hidden. It felt more like it was studying me than I was studying it. I'm not here to convince anyone. I'm just telling you what I remember. After that night, Doverfield kept on being a quiet place. People still go to Elmshire Park, enjoy the trees and the lake, and life goes on. But I still wonder what's lurking in those woods. Sometimes, when I think about it, I get the same uneasy feeling I had back then. The feeling that something might be watching from behind the trees, silently observing and waiting. I don't think it ever left. It just stopped showing itself, like a secret that the forest holds close. I've never found a rational explanation, and maybe I never will. Story 3. I remember it was early in the morning, sometime in the fall of 1991. I can't recall the exact date, but I know it was right at that hour when the first hint of sunlight filters through the redwoods. I'd been running in Redwood National Park near Monroe Creek for years, making it a daily habit before heading to work. The place usually felt peaceful, almost comforting. Birds calling out, the faint sound of small critters moving in the underbrush, and that distinct scent of damp earth and moss that you only get in old-growth forests. But on that day, something felt off. The air was heavier. My usual route ran along a well-trodden path that looped through the giant trees and eventually brought me near a known waterfall that most locals and a few tourists frequented. But I decided to veer off toward a lesser-known waterfall, just to change things up, to see something different. I'd heard about this other spot from a guy I knew at a local diner. He'd said it was quieter, more secluded, and kind of a hidden gem. At first, that sounded perfect. I figured I'd enjoy a more private view, take a moment to breathe in the forest, and then head back. But as I made my way there, the normal background sounds seemed to vanish. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. Not a peaceful quiet either, more like a vacuum, like the forest was holding its breath. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. The only sound was my own footsteps on the damp ground and my breathing, which gradually grew more uneasy as I noticed how unnatural this silence was. I tried to tell myself it was just a weird morning. Maybe the local wildlife was off doing something else, but it didn't sit right with me. You spend enough time outdoors, you learn the difference between a normal quiet day and something being really wrong. I stopped for a second, scanning the ground. That's when I saw these strange tracks in the dirt. They weren't just large, they were huge, and not just large in a casual Bigfoot sense. They were shaped wrong, elongated in a way that didn't match any animal print I'd ever seen. I'd encountered deer, black bears, even the rare mountain lion tracks before. But this was different. The impressions were deep, as if something incredibly heavy had stepped there. Some nearby branches were twisted at odd angles, not snapped clean, but almost bent around. I couldn't imagine what could have done that. I knelt down to get a closer look and noticed how fresh they seemed, the edges of the print still crumbling slightly inward. Whatever made them had to be close. At that point, the hairs on the back of my neck started prickling. I tried to brush it off, but I felt watched. It's that primal feeling you get sometimes, like when someone stands too close behind you, only there was no one around, or so I thought. I got up and started to walk again, trying to keep my pace steady and act natural, as if that would fool whatever might be out there. Not long after, I saw another person ahead. She was standing near a cluster of ferns, breathing hard like she'd been running faster than she meant to. I recognized her vaguely. Mila, I think was her name. I'd seen her a couple of times on the Maine trails. She looked rattled, glancing back over her shoulder, her eyes wide and shiny like she'd just seen something that didn't fit her understanding of the world. I approached her cautiously. And although I'm not much of a talker, I asked if she was okay. She told me she'd seen something. She struggled to put it into words, but the fear in her voice was enough. She kept saying she didn't know what it was, just that it was big, and it moved in a way that made her stomach drop. She tried to describe it, but kept trailing off, her hands shaking slightly. Hearing this, my heart rate went up even more. I already felt that something was off, and now I had someone else confirming it. Neither of us felt like heading back deeper alone, so we decided to stick together. Without saying much, we started moving forward, partly because we wanted to know what was going on, and partly because we were too scared to turn our backs on that area of the forest. The light under those massive trees was dim, and the silence there was different, thick, like a warning. As we pushed on, every sound made me flinch. A crack of a branch to the left, then the faint sound of something large brushing through the bushes on the right. And always that feeling that we were being followed, or watched, or maybe even hunted. We tried to get our bearings, but with the trees so dense, it was easy to lose the familiar landmarks. The big redwoods around us formed these strange shapes in the half-light, some trunks twisted in ways that vaguely resembled hunched figures. I kept thinking I saw something move at the edge of my vision, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing obvious, just shadows. We had no cell phones back then, at least not in any way that mattered out there. And even if we did, I doubt we'd get a signal. We were too far in. I remember cursing under my breath, realizing we were basically cut off and on our own. That's when we found another set of footprints, even clearer than the first. They were huge, about twice the length of my own shoe, and oddly shaped. Not like a human foot, not like a bear's paw. It was something else. Mila shot me a look that needed no words. I was shaken, trying to keep it together, but it was getting harder to rationalize what we were seeing. We decided we needed some kind of temporary safe spot. There was a fallen log nearby, creating a small hollow underneath, almost like a makeshift shelter. We crouched there for a moment, trying to calm our nerves and think straight. The silence was broken now and then by leaves rustling or distant snaps of branches. Nothing sounded small. Whatever was out there was big, and it knew how to move through the forest without showing itself clearly. I remember smelling something odd at one point, a musky, earthy scent, almost like wet fur combined with that damp, decaying forest smell. It was faint, but it came in a wave and then faded. Mila whispered something like, "Do you smell that?" And I just nodded. It was enough to make my stomach tighten. We decided to head back toward where we knew the main path was, aiming roughly in the direction of the park's entrance. Every step was careful. We tried not to make noise, but the forest floor was thick with fallen needles and twigs. At one point behind us, there was a deep grunt or a low growl. I'm not sure how to describe it. It sounded like something large exhaling hard, a frustrated sound maybe. We froze. I scanned between the trees, expecting to see some shape towering in the gloom, but still nothing showed itself. That was almost worse than actually seeing it, the uncertainty of it all. Somehow, after what felt like an eternity, we reached a part of the woods where the trees weren't so tightly packed. There was a slight thinning, and with it, a bit more light. Almost immediately, I noticed the birdsong picking up again, as if we had crossed some invisible boundary where the forest's normal rules applied once more. A breeze moved through the leaves, and for a second I felt a wave of relief, like we'd made it out of a trapped place and back into the world I recognized. We hurried down the trail until we reached a service road near the park's edge. There were a couple of rangers there, and we tried to explain what happened. We told them about the footprints, the silence, that feeling of being watched, and that low grunt. We pointed out that something huge had been out there. They listened, but I could tell they were skeptical. They said they'd check the area, but without any solid evidence, A hair sample, a clear footprint cast, or an actual sighting. There wasn't much they could do. We must have looked pretty rattled, though, because they did radio someone to have a look around. I never found out if they discovered anything. Over the weeks after that incident, I asked around, but everyone just kind of brushed it off or chalked it up to stress or imagination. I know what I experienced, though, and I'm certain Mila does too. We didn't see some trick of the light or misinterpret a normal animal. Something was there, something that had no trouble staying hidden while reminding us that it was in control of that part of the forest. Even now, thinking back on it, I can feel that uneasy twist in my gut. I've run through that park many times since, always on my usual route, never deviating again. That morning stands out like a scar in my memory. I can't explain it, no one can, and maybe that's what makes it worse. It happened, and then it was over, leaving me with nothing but confusion and fear, and the unshakable sense that something big and unknown calls Redwood National Park home. I don't know what it was, and I'll probably never know, but I'll never forget it. Story 4. Back in 1985, I was a journalist trying to chase down anything that could give me a good story. I ended up near Oak Ridge, Arizona, in this place called Keem's Canyon. The locals had these weird rumors floating around, something big, hairy and dangerous out there, though no one could say for sure what it was. I thought it was probably just tall tales. I remember it was incredibly dry and hot, the kind of heat that makes your shirt stick to your back no matter how little you move. The canyon walls were massive, with these jagged edges and deep shadows that looked like they were hiding something. I was with a forest ranger named Roderick Stanridge, a tall guy, kind of stiff, always keeping his hand near his holster. I guess he'd heard those stories too, or at least took them seriously enough not to let his guard down. That morning, we walked along some lesser-known trails, the kind that don't even show up on normal maps. Roderick wanted to check out areas where visitors had been complaining about odd noises and strange smells. I'm not a big cryptid believer, but I was curious. I remember noticing large scratches on tree trunks, long, deep gouges that looked too big for any mountain lion. The ground was sandy and loose, and we found these footprints that didn't match anything I recognized. Bigger than a human foot, definitely not a bear's paw, and sort of elongated. I knelt down and ran my fingertips along the outline. I can still remember how unsettling it felt. It wasn't just the shape. It was the feeling that whoever made these prints walked through here very recently. The edges of the impression were sharp, not blurred by wind or time. Roderick and I weren't alone in that area. We came across a couple of other hikers who looked rattled. One guy, his name was Rucker Tiverton, was particularly on edge. He kept glancing over his shoulder. I asked him if he'd seen something, and he said he'd been hearing these low, guttural noises around dusk the day before. He described it as something like a huge animal breathing heavily, or maybe trying to communicate with low grunts. He sounded almost embarrassed to admit it. We decided we'd all stick together because, well, why not? None of us had any signal on our phones. This was the 80s after all, and we were basically on our own out there. We spent the afternoon moving further into the canyon, the sun beating down hard. The silence was overwhelming. In a normal forest you hear birds, insects, leaves rustling. Here we had almost nothing, just occasional puffs of dry wind that kicked up dust. The emptiness made every scratch in the bark, every strange footprint seem so much worse. It felt like something was watching us, pacing us from a distance. I'm not saying I saw anything yet, but there was this sensation, like you're being sized up. Every few minutes I'd look up and see Roderick tense, scanning the terrain. He clearly felt it too. As daylight faded, we tried to set up a small camp in an area with a half circle of rocks and a bit of open space. We had lanterns and flashlights, plus a couple of portable lamps. I remember the canyon's walls turning dark orange, then red, and finally everything fell into a deep blackness. The temperature dropped fast. The desert can do that, scorching by day and chilling by night. We placed the lanterns around us to create a perimeter of light. None of us said it out loud, but I think we all hoped that if something approached, we'd at least catch a glimpse of it before it got too close. After a couple of hours in the dark, we started hearing these strange noises. Not constant, but now and then we'd catch what sounded like dry branches snapping under something heavy. Once, I even heard a muffled grunt that made the hairs on my neck stand straight up. I held my flashlight tight, shining it toward the direction of the noise, but I only ever saw rocks, scraggly bushes, and empty space. The waiting was terrible. My heart was pounding, and my mouth kept going dry. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. Every crack made me flinch. At one point, we heard this deep, resonant thump, like someone had dropped a heavy log onto a rock. It came from somewhere behind a ridge just out of sight. We rushed over with our flashlights, but we found nothing, just that unsettling quiet again. But now the quiet seemed to move with us, like something was deliberately staying just beyond our lights, creeping along the edges of our vision. Rucker started panicking a bit. I could hear his breathing getting louder, and Roderick had to tell him to keep it down, even though he was clearly scared too. None of us wanted to say the word Bigfoot. It felt too ridiculous at the time, but we were all thinking it. There were these stories. Everyone in Oak Ridge had heard them, but no one took them seriously, right? And yet here we were, terrified of something we couldn't see. I remember shining my flashlight up on a ledge for just a split second and seeing a strange silhouette. It was tall, taller than any man I've ever seen. The outline vanished as soon as my light hit it. I tried to convince myself it was just a weird rock formation, or maybe my imagination playing tricks. My mind was racing. Was it just a shadow? A weird shape of the rocks? I still don't know, and that uncertainty still haunts me. Later in the night, Roderick pointed out fresh footprints in the sand near our camp. They weren't there before. Whatever made them came close while we were all staring in the wrong direction. It was big, and it moved quietly. That was the part that freaked me out most. Something that heavy should have made noise, but it slipped in and out like a ghost. The hours crawled by, and none of us slept. We just sat there with the lanterns flickering, our eyes burning from straining into the dark. Occasionally, we'd pick up a faint sound, breathing, or a low growl, or something moving a stone out of place. At one point, a distant, slow, grunting call echoed through the canyon walls. It sounded frustrated or angry or, I don't know. I've never heard an animal make a sound like that. You could feel the vibration of it in your chest. We never got a clear view. Not a face, not the full figure, nothing. Just footprints, scratches, weird noises, and that suffocating feeling of being hunted. By early morning, we were spent. The sky began to lighten, and as the sun started creeping over the canyon rim, whatever was out there slipped away for good. We checked the area one last time as the light improved. Footprints leading nowhere, broken twigs in odd patterns, some scattered rocks that looked freshly overturned, but nothing concrete. We hiked out of there exhausted, dirty, and shaken to the core. Once back on the main road toward Oak Ridge, the normal world rushed back in. Cars passing by, distant ranch houses, the sound of birds that I'd normally ignore now seemed comforting. But I couldn't shake the tension in my shoulders. I didn't know what to do with what I'd just experienced. Who would believe it? I ended up telling a few people in town. They nodded, listened, but I could see that look in their eyes, like they'd heard it all before and didn't think much of it. No one ever found any solid evidence. The authorities checked the area and turned up nothing. To this day, I have no explanation. I know what I heard and felt out there, And I know that something big and intelligent was messing with us that night. It didn't feel random. It felt calculated, like it wanted us scared and confused. Ever since then, I've believed that something lives in Keem's Canyon, something that knows how to stay hidden and make people question their sanity. Whatever it was never showed itself fully, never attacked us outright, but it left a lasting mark on my mind. I still think about those footprints and that silent shape just out of reach of my flashlight beam. No proof, no photographs, nothing that would convince a skeptic. Just the memory of that night and the lingering dread it still brings me. I don't think I'll ever really shake it. Story 5. I still remember that day in 1994, like it was yesterday. My cousin Nolan and I had decided to head out on a section of the Appalachian Trail near Pine Grove, Pennsylvania. We'd been wanting to disconnect from our usual routines and just breathe some fresh air, maybe spot a few deer, take in the old forest scenery. We knew that area wasn't known for anything particularly dangerous, so we figured it would be a calm trip, just another day hike, maybe a short overnight if we found a nice spot. But things turned out a lot weirder than we ever could have imagined. We started early in the morning, probably around 7 a.m., with our backpacks loaded just with essentials: water, a bit of food, a first aid kit, flashlights. The trail was quiet, and the weather was pretty much perfect. Cool, but not cold, and the sun was bright enough that we could see clearly as we walked. The trees out there are tall and thick, and the sunlight filters through in this kind of gentle greenish glow. We didn't talk much at first, just moved at a steady pace, listening to the birds and our own footsteps crunching over leaves and twigs. After a couple of hours, we came across something odd. We noticed some branches along the side of the trail that were snapped in a weird pattern, like someone had twisted them at a height that would be hard for a normal person to reach. Nolan joked that maybe it was a bear with a bad attitude, but there was a strange feeling that came with it. The forest, which had been pretty lively with chirps and rustling, seemed to quiet down whenever we tried to focus on these odd signs. It was subtle, but you know when you get that feeling that something's off? We tried not to dwell on it. We just thought, okay, weird stuff happens in the wild. Maybe a storm damage or a bear, who knows? We kept going, and about midday we reached an old wooden cabin that we'd heard about from other hikers. It's supposed to be abandoned, just a known landmark along a less traveled spur of the trail. From a distance it looked like any old shack, broken windows, a sagging roof, moss growing on the side. But as we got closer, we saw these deep scratches along the walls. They weren't random bear claw marks. I've seen what bear scratches look like on trees and cabins before. These were different, arranged in a strange, almost deliberate pattern. It looked like something large and powerful had deliberately dragged rough fingertips across the wood, over and over. The wood was shredded in places, and I could feel my skin crawling just looking at it. We didn't want to linger there, but Nolan pointed out tracks in the soft ground around the cabin. They were huge footprints, and not really bear-like at all. I mean, I'm not a professional tracker, but these looked like giant human footprints, only the toes seemed off. I tried telling myself it was just some prank, maybe some local kids messing around, but they were too big, and the depth in the soil suggested something heavy, very heavy. This was the point where both of us started feeling genuinely uneasy. The air felt heavier, like the forest was holding its breath. There was no wind at all, and I remember straining my ears, trying to catch the usual forest sounds, squirrels chattering, birds calling. It was dead silent. Something about that silence was worse than if we had actually seen something terrible right in front of us. It was just that oppressive quiet, like a warning. We decided to keep moving. We weren't going to set up camp anywhere near that cabin, that was for sure. Honestly, I just wanted to get back to a more familiar part of the trail. As we moved on, we tried to speed up our pace, but we had that sensation that we weren't alone. Several times I thought I saw something moving quickly among the thick trunks, just a dark shape, tall and covered in something like hair. It never stayed in sight long enough for me to say, "Look, there it is." It was always out of the corner of my eye, so fast and silent that I doubted myself right after seeing it. Nolan said he caught glimpses too, but he kept insisting we were just getting paranoid. Then came the sound. It was distant at first, like a low grunt or growl, muffled by layers of branches and leaves. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It seemed to move around, first behind us, then maybe to the side. We sped up even more, practically jogging on a section of the trail that usually we'd take our time enjoying. I remember my heart pounding in my ears. The smell of the damp earth and crushed ferns underfoot usually would calm me, but not that day. That day, all I could think about was getting out of that area. We reached a more familiar part of the trail in the late afternoon, somewhere near an old lean-to shelter that's used by through hikers. To our relief, there was someone else there, a woman named Clara we'd met briefly before at another point along the trail. She looked on edge, pacing near the shelter's entrance. Before we could even say anything about our experience, she asked if we had felt anything strange. We told her we had, and she nodded, saying she hadn't slept well the night before because she'd been feeling watched and had heard something heavy walking around the camp area in the dark. She never got a good look at it either, just a sense of something big circling around. Having a third person confirm that something was off kind of made it all scarier. I know that sounds weird, but up until that point, Nolan and I were trying to write it off as our nerves or just misidentifying noises. Clara's unease made it real. We decided right then that sticking around was a bad idea. Nightfall would only make it worse. We grabbed our gear and basically agreed to head straight back down toward the village below. As we descended, I kept turning around, half expecting to see this tall, hairy shape charging down the trail. The trees were still, but I swear I could feel eyes on my back. We didn't speak much, just the occasional whisper to keep moving, to not slow down. The path was a mix of loose leaves and damp soil, and a couple of times I slipped, grabbing branches to steady myself. Each time I paused, I'd hear a crack of wood somewhere behind us, a branch snapping under weight. We never saw it full on. That's one thing that still gets to me. It stayed hidden, always just out of clear view. I never saw a face. I never got a perfect silhouette. But the presence was there, and the fear felt absolutely real. Eventually, as we got closer to the lower sections of the trail and the landscape opened up a bit, the feeling started to fade. We weren't running anymore, just hurrying with a certain determination. By the time we reached the village, the sun was starting to set. We went straight to a park ranger station and tried to explain what happened. The ranger we talked to listened, but I could tell he wasn't fully convinced. He said they'd go up and check, but they never reported finding anything unusual. We even described the cabin, the scratches, and the footprints. The ranger just nodded and said he'd send someone to take a look. I don't know what they found, if anything, but I never heard any follow-up. Everything just went quiet. Nolan and I talked about it for weeks afterward, trying to make sense of it. We considered bears. We considered some strange person living off the grid. We even considered that maybe it was all in our heads. But we both know what we felt. Clara knows what she felt too, and she left that area as soon as she could. To this day, I can't really explain it. I'm not someone who believes in every weird tale out there, but something was up in those woods. Something was watching us, following us. Those huge footprints, those unnatural scratches, the unsettling quiet. It just doesn't add up to any normal wildlife encounter I've ever heard of. I've gone hiking plenty of times since, but never in that exact spot again. I have no desire to run into whatever that thing was. Maybe it was a Bigfoot. Maybe it was something else entirely. But all I know is that it was real to us. Real enough to send us running and keep me on edge for years afterward. I still get a chill down my spine thinking about that day. It started out so normal, just another hike, and ended with us practically fleeing the forest, convinced we weren't alone. I've never gotten any good answers, and maybe I never will. It happened, and then it just stopped, like the woods swallowed up whatever it was and went back to normal the moment we left. The memory still keeps me up some nights, wondering what we stumbled into that afternoon in Pine Grove. Story 6. I remember that day in 1992 like it just happened. It was a cold morning, late October, I think. I'd been living in Westbury, Maine for a few months, trying to get away from my old life in a busier city. My new place was more isolated than I'd ever been used to. Tall pines, the sound of the ocean in the distance, the smell of salt in the air. I'd moved there hoping for a quieter life, just me and the surrounding nature. But that morning, I realized there was something off about the land around my property. I hadn't believed the local stories at first. People talked about weird sightings, something big lurking in the forest. I figured it was just locals having fun with the newcomer. But on that particular morning, I decided to do some exploring. I felt uneasy even before I left the house. I can't explain it, but it was like the whole forest was a bit too quiet. Normally, you'd hear birds, small animals rustling, distant sounds of life. That day, it felt like the woods were holding their breath. I tried to shake it off and went on anyway. There was a cave not too far from my land, maybe a 15-minute walk through the trees. I'd discovered it earlier that month. I remember the first time I saw it. It was just a gap in a rocky outcrop, mostly hidden by brush. But once you knew it was there, it was hard to ignore. It had this stale, damp smell even from a few yards away. Nothing pleasant about it really, but it drew my curiosity. Sometimes I could swear there was a faint metallic scent lingering near the entrance, but I always assumed I was imagining it. That day, as I headed toward it, I noticed strange marks on a nearby tree trunk, deep scratches carved into the wood, as if something with long claws had raked through it. I'd never seen marks like that before. Bears tend to leave certain patterns, and this was off. The bark was torn in uneven strips, and the wood underneath looked almost gouged. There were branches twisted at odd angles around it, like something large had passed through without caring what it destroyed. It made me pause, and I suddenly wished I'd brought something for protection. But I just had my coat, sturdy boots, and a flashlight in my pocket. Before I reached the cave, I ran into Lucy Merrick. She was out there looking for a missing local. Some guy had been gone for a couple of days. Lucy was one of the more practical people in town. She wasn't the type to make up stories. She was shaken, though. She said she'd found huge footprints near the cave the night before and heard something moving around out there. She also mentioned odd sounds, heavy footsteps, and a sort of low rumbling noise. She'd come to the area again that morning to see if there were more clues about the missing guy. I wasn't sure what to think, but I remember how her voice trembled a bit and how she kept glancing over her shoulder. It wasn't comforting. Lucy and I decided to check the cave. I'm not sure why we thought that was a good idea, but I guess we felt like we should at least see if there was anything inside that could explain the strange noises or the disappearance. The cave entrance was narrow, and you had to turn your shoulders a bit to get through. Inside, the air was thicker and had that same damp, metallic smell. Our flashlights caught bits of cloth on the ground, torn fabric that could have come from a shirt or maybe a backpack. Hard to say. I remember crouching down and picking up a piece. It was dirty, stained, and felt oddly stiff, like it had dried after being soaked in something. I didn't mention that to Lucy at the time, but I knew what I feared it might be. We went deeper, moving slowly, trying not to make noise. The floor of the cave wasn't smooth. It was scattered with small rocks and uneven patches of dirt. I noticed more odd signs, some hair or fur caught on a jagged rock, brownish and coarse, not like deer or bear fur I'd seen before. The smell inside kept getting stronger, and it made my eyes water a bit. We didn't talk. We just kept scanning the darkness ahead. Then we heard it. A low grunt or growl coming from somewhere deeper in the cave. Lucy froze, and I could feel my heart thudding in my chest. I pointed my flashlight toward the sound, but all I could see was darkness and uneven stone walls. We both stayed quiet, holding our breath. For a long moment there was no sound, but the faint drip of water somewhere in the cave. I remember how loud my own breathing sounded in my ears. Out of nowhere, something moved in the darkness. I caught a glimpse of a large shape passing behind a rock formation, just a silhouette really, but it was tall and bulky. The way it moved was unsettling, almost hunched but powerful. I remember the dull sound of something heavy scraping against stone. It wasn't a person. It wasn't moving like a person at all. We didn't stick around to see more. That was enough for me. I grabbed Lucy's sleeve and we started backing out, keeping our flashlights trained on where we'd seen the shape. At one point, it felt like the cave swallowed up all the sound again, and I couldn't tell if it was following us or staying put. As soon as we reached the narrow entrance and slipped out into the daylight, we started running toward Lucy's place. It wasn't far, but I remember feeling like the forest itself had changed. Every tree seemed to hide something behind it. Every branch that snapped under our feet sounded too loud. My chest felt tight and my mouth was dry. At Lucy's house we tried calling for help, but cell service was sketchy, and it wasn't like we had a quick way to reach authorities. Eventually, forest rangers did come out after we managed to get through. We showed them the cave, the marks on the trees, and the torn cloth. They looked concerned but tried to keep calm. Still, they didn't find the creature. They combed through the area, found some odd footprints, huge and deep, but no clear answers. A couple of them mentioned a strange smell, just like we did, and they noted the abnormal silence in that part of the forest. But in the end, they had nothing to show for it but a few unsettling observations. When I think back on it, the worst part was knowing that something that large and that quiet was out there, not making any effort to show itself unless it wanted to. The missing person was never officially linked to what we saw or what we almost saw, but Lucy and I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever vanished might have had the misfortune of crossing its path. The following hours after the rangers left were tense. Lucy's home felt safer, but it didn't feel safe enough. We locked the doors and kept close to the windows, looking out whenever we heard a noise. But nothing else happened that day. The sounds stopped, the strange smell faded, and it was like the forest decided to return to its normal routine by late afternoon. There were birds calling again, and the wind rustled the pines. Everything seemed to settle back into place, except we knew something was off out there, something we couldn't explain. To this day, I still don't know what it was. I've never seen anything like it since. Lucy and I stopped talking openly about it with others because no one really believed us. They either thought we got spooked by a bear or made it all up. But I know what I smelled. I know what I saw. Those footprints, those scratches, that huge shape moving in the darkness of that cave. It's been over 20 years now, and I still get chills remembering it. Sometimes late at night, I replay the moment we were inside that cave and how the silence felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us. There was something breathing in there, something watching us. We never got any solid explanation. Life went on. The missing person case remained unsolved, and the forest still stands there, quiet and beautiful to anyone who doesn't know better. But after that day, I always kept my distance from that cave. Some things you can't force to make sense, and some things you're just better off leaving alone. Story 7. I still remember how the air tasted that evening, damp and cold, like the whole forest was holding its breath. It was late fall 1990, just outside a tiny community called Strangeville in North Carolina. I'd driven in that morning to investigate some local disappearances for the paper I worked for at the time. The town itself wasn't much more than a few old shops, a small diner, and a single gas station. There were stories going around of something lurking just beyond the tree line. Nobody wanted to say Bigfoot or anything like that directly, but that's what everyone was hinting at. The rumors had been hard to ignore, and I figured it was at least worth looking into. By late afternoon, I'd spoken to a handful of people, including Lydia, a local who'd lived there her entire life. She kept shaking her head as she told me about weird footprints she found near her property and distant screams that didn't sound like any animal she knew. I remember meeting her at the diner, its neon sign buzzing like a tired insect, where she stirred her coffee absently and glanced at the forest through the window as if it had eyes. Lydia wasn't some gullible tourist. She seemed like a practical woman, someone who knew how to handle herself outdoors. When she talked about what she'd seen, her voice got quieter, more careful. She said something was off in the woods, that the normal forest sounds had been replaced by a silence so thick you could feel it pressing on your ears. That's when I decided to go check it out myself, and Lydia insisted on coming with me. I could tell she was nervous. Hell, I was nervous too, but it felt like we both wanted some kind of closure. Some proof that this was just a misunderstanding or a big bear or something explainable. We waited until the sun was just about gone. I guess we thought the timing might help us notice things we wouldn't see during the bright afternoon. Armed with a flashlight, my notepad, and an old camera that still used film, we headed toward the edge of the woods. At first, it felt normal, just the crunch of leaves under our boots, the subtle scent of pine and wet earth. But as we moved deeper, the familiar sounds started fading out. It wasn't immediate. It was like each noise got choked off, one by one, until we were left in a quiet that felt unnatural. No wind, no insects, no distant hoot of an owl. I've never experienced silence like that before. I could feel my own heartbeat in my ears. We pushed through dense undergrowth, the flashlight beam bouncing off tree trunks. At one point, Lydia nudged me and pointed at some marks on a tree. Large, deep scratches running parallel, maybe 7 feet off the ground. They weren't random scratches either. They looked deliberate, like something strong had dug into the bark with purpose. I tried to keep my voice steady as I said something like, "That's not a black bear," but Lydia just nodded grimly. We found similar marks on a few other trees, spaced oddly, as if something had moved through the area, marking its path. The smell there was thick, kind of rotten, but not exactly like decay, more like a mix of damp earth and animal musk that stuck in the back of my throat. As the light faded, the forest took on this strange quality. Everything felt closer. The trees seemed to lean in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just nerves, or a trick of the dim light. But Lydia felt it too. I could tell by how tight she was gripping her jacket and how her eyes darted from shadow to shadow. We decided to turn back, but the journey out seemed longer than the way in. It was as if the forest had shifted behind us, making the return path unfamiliar. At some point, we heard heavy steps, not running, not rushing toward us, just deliberate heavy steps that seemed to match our movements. Whenever I swung the flashlight around, I saw nothing but branches and brush. But the second I moved the beam away, I'd hear something again. Twigs snapping, leaves being pushed aside. It sounded big, heavier than a person, and it never made a sound when I tried to catch it with the light. We picked up our pace, trying to keep calm, but that's when we started noticing these soft, low grunts. They were distant at first, but then they came from different angles, like something circling us. It's hard to describe the sound, deeper than a human voice, but not quite like any animal call I've heard. It had a resonance to it, a kind of throaty vibration that made the hair on my arms stand up. I felt trapped, like we were being corralled. We tried calling out, just to break the tension, to let whatever was out there know we were aware of it. But as soon as Lydia let out a shaky, "Hello?" the forest exploded with motion, not rushing toward us but around us, branches swaying without any wind, distant thuds that didn't quite make sense. We didn't talk after that. We just kept moving, as quietly as we could, trying not to panic. I remember tripping over a root and nearly dropping my camera. When I got up, Lydia grabbed my shoulder, hard. She pointed ahead. For a split second, I swear I saw a silhouette, tall, broad and hunched, its outline blending into the background. It looked like something covered in dark, matted hair. I tried to get the flashlight on it, but it slipped away into the darkness too fast, impossibly fast for something so large. The panic really set in then. I could barely think straight. Everything felt too real. My heart pounding, sweat trickling down my neck despite the cool air, my legs shaking as I tried to keep them moving forward. Lydia was breathing fast, whispering something I couldn't fully catch. Maybe a prayer, maybe just nonsense. I wanted to run, but I knew if we bolted, whatever was out there might give chase. So we stumbled forward, step by step, with this awful feeling that something was right behind us, just out of sight. At one point, the ground sloped down, and I slipped again. When I got my bearings, Lydia had stopped walking and was staring behind us with wide eyes. I didn't see what she saw, but I heard it. A soft grunt, closer than before. I shone the flashlight back and caught a glimpse of something moving between two trunks. Just a flicker of fur and a large arm, or leg, I couldn't tell, pulling back into the darkness. The shape was massive, at least a head taller than any person I've met, and so quiet when it wanted to be. We tried to hurry without making too much noise, weaving between trees, ducking under branches. It felt like hours, but I'm sure it was just minutes. Every time I thought we'd lost it, I'd hear a heavy footstep or a low exhale. The forest floor was covered in wet leaves, and I remember my boots slipping on them, my ankle twisting slightly. The pain barely registered. The adrenaline masked most of it. I just wanted out. When we finally broke through the tree line, the town's main street lights looked like something from another world. That weak yellow glow of the street lamps was the most comforting thing I'd ever seen. We stumbled out onto the dirt road, breathing hard, our clothes damp with sweat and the forest's moisture. The sound of a distant car engine and muffled voices from somewhere in town felt like stepping into sanity again. We looked back, expecting to see something emerge from the darkness, but nothing did. The forest just loomed there, silent as ever. It was as if whatever was inside had no intention of showing itself under the lights. It kept its secrets just behind that last wall of trees. Later, we tried to explain what happened to the local police. The officers listened, but I could tell they didn't really buy it. We had no clear photos. The camera flash only produced blurry shapes and grainy darkness. We told them about the scratches on the trees, the footsteps, the smell, the silhouette. They humored us, said they'd send someone out the next day, and to their credit, they actually did. They found some odd prints, weird marks that didn't fit any animal common to the area, but nothing definitive, nothing that screamed undiscovered creature or mysterious monster. Just enough strange evidence to keep the rumors alive. To this day, I can't tell you what we encountered. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I hear a strange noise at night or catch a whiff of that earthy, musky scent. Lydia and I parted ways soon after. I returned to the city, filed my half-baked report, and watched as the story got buried in a small column on the back pages. Nobody really cared, or they just didn't know what to make of it. Life went on. I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there in that forest, watching anyone who dares step off the beaten path. We never got an explanation, no big reveal, no final confrontation. It just happened, and then stopped, like the woods decided to spit us out and return to its quiet, hidden existence. Sometimes that's the part that keeps me up at night, the fact that we weren't attacked, we weren't chased down to the bitter end. It was more like it was letting us know that we didn't belong, and then it let us go. I still don't know why. I still don't know what we saw, but I'll never forget how that silence felt, and how the forest seemed alive with something we could barely comprehend. Story 8. I remember it was late autumn of 1989, sometime after dusk, and I was on my usual route home. I lived in Plainsford, Kansas, a small industrial town that never really shook off the rust and dust from its old days. Back then, everybody knew about the abandoned factory that sat just off the main road out of town. You couldn't miss it, even if you tried. Its towering, half-collapsed chimneys and gutted walls were hard to ignore. People said that place was cursed or something along those lines. I never paid much attention. But that night, for whatever reason, I got curious. I'd worked a late shift, and the whole area felt eerily quiet. The sky was moonless, the stars scattered thinly, and the wind had a low whistle I could feel in my ears. I had parked my truck a bit down the road because I'd been having engine trouble. It was old and started acting up more frequently than I liked. Anyway, I had to pass near that factory on foot. As I walked, I got this nagging feeling I should just keep my head down and move along, but I stopped, shining my flashlight into the open yard. The place looked like an old wound in the earth, crumbling walls, twisted metal beams, shattered windows. Nobody ever went there anymore. I knew the stories. Strange sounds after dark, weird shapes caught in the corner of your eye, unexplained footprints in the dust. But I had never actually bothered to step inside. That night, I decided to look around. Just a quick look, I told myself. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was just boredom, or maybe I wanted a thrill. I climbed through an opening that might have once been a door. Inside, the air smelled stale, like old iron filings, mixed with something else I can't put into words. It wasn't rot, not exactly, but something animal-like, a musk that didn't belong in a place made of steel and concrete. The only light I had came from my flashlight, and it wasn't great. It kept flickering every time I moved it too fast. The interior was a mess. Broken machinery, twisted conveyor belts, old drums and containers scattered around. The floors were covered in dirt and debris, and there were these strange drag marks like something heavy had been hauled over the ground. I remember feeling my stomach tighten when I noticed them. They led deeper into the factory, out of my beam of light. I tried to stay calm, but I couldn't ignore how tense my shoulders felt. I kept telling myself it was just junk someone had moved around at some point, maybe old scrap metal, but I couldn't shake off the sense I was being watched. You know that sensation you get when someone's standing behind you even though you can't hear a thing? I had that, strong as ever. And every few steps I took, I stopped to listen. At first, it was only the wind rattling through the metal beams. Then, after a while, I started hearing soft noises, like a low, distant grunt. I turned and pointed the flashlight down one dark corridor, and I thought I saw a shape, tall and wide, with matted hair. But when I focused the beam, there was nothing, just old crates and a collapsed stairwell. My heartbeat was pounding in my ears. My chest felt too tight, like I couldn't get enough air. I remember thinking, this is stupid, I should leave now. The place felt wrong, like I'd walked into something's territory. Not a person's. No homeless drifter or curious teen would make that kind of sound. I couldn't help imagining something huge and silent stalking me. The stories about this place always hinted at strange creatures. Some people even whispered about big, hairy things that could break you in half. I always laughed those stories off, but in that moment, my laughter felt a million miles away. I decided I'd had enough. I turned around and tried retracing my steps to the way I came in. But here's the strange part. Nothing looked familiar. Every corridor looked like the last. Cracked cement, dangling pipes, rusted beams, all blending into a maze. I retraced my path, or at least I tried. I went left, then right, then back again. The darkness seemed thicker. My flashlight caught dust motes floating in the air, making it hard to see beyond a few feet. Then I heard something scrape against metal, like claws dragging along a beam. I whipped my flashlight around, my hands shaking. I could have sworn I saw movement, just a quick flash of something hairy ducking behind a column. My throat went dry. I didn't dare call out. The idea of making noise seemed like a bad idea. My instincts told me I was prey. I can't explain it better than that. There was a presence in there, something that knew I was lost and panicking. I forced myself forward, trying to find any sign of an exit. I stepped over broken pipes and kicked aside old rags and scraps of metal. The smell seemed to get stronger the further I went. My eyes were watering, and my hands were sweating so much I almost dropped the flashlight. Every time I slowed down, I heard another subtle noise. Breathing, a low growl, a grunt. I tried telling myself it was just the wind moaning through the rafters, but it didn't sound like that. It had a wet, throaty quality, like something alive. At some point, I saw a cluster of old wooden pallets and decided to climb over them. On the other side, there was a faint sliver of light. Maybe it was just moonlight slipping through a crack in the wall, but at that moment, it felt like a lifesaver. I rushed toward it, tripping over cables and nearly twisting my ankle. I didn't care. I just needed to get out. As I got closer, something slammed behind me. A loud metallic bang that echoed through that chamber of rust. I pointed the flashlight back and caught a blur of movement. I couldn't make it out clearly, but it seemed large, hulking, covered in dark hair, with arms that hung low. My heart nearly stopped. I wanted to scream, but I just held my breath, shaking. It stared at me. I know it did. I could feel it, even if I couldn't see its eyes. I froze for what felt like an eternity, waiting to see if it would charge at me. I don't know why it didn't. Maybe I was too close to the exit. Maybe it was just curious. Maybe it was playing with me. I have no idea. I only know that in a sudden burst of courage or desperation I turned and ran like hell. I ran toward that faint glow of night outside. My legs felt like lead and my lungs burned. I kept expecting a massive hand to grab my shoulder and pull me backward, but it never happened. When I finally slipped out through a half-open side door, I almost fell face first into the dirt outside. The cool air hit my face like a slap, and I could see the stars overhead. My body felt so light, and I realized I'd been holding my breath longer than I thought. I turned back to look, my flashlight beam shaking on the twisted metal of the doorframe. I couldn't see anything inside, just blackness. But I swore I could still feel it standing there, just a few feet back, hidden by the darkness, watching. I didn't bother investigating further. I just left. I walked straight back to my truck without looking back again. The entire time, I felt like I was being followed. But when I reached the main road, it was silent. Just the distant hum of the night and a single streetlight near the edge of town. Later, I told a few people what happened. Some laughed, some looked at me like I was nuts. Maybe I am, maybe I imagined it, but I know what I felt. I wasn't the type to believe in monsters. I still don't know what was in there. But after that night, I stopped going anywhere near that factory. I can't shake the feeling that something lives inside those walls, something that doesn't belong in our world, something that doesn't fear us. Or maybe it just found me too boring to bother with. I honestly don't know. All I know is that, to this day, I can't explain what I saw or what I heard. I have no proof, just my memory of that awful stench, those strange dragging marks on the floor, and the hulking shape that watched me from the shadows. I still get chills when I think about it. It happened, and then it ended, as abruptly as it began. I never got any closure, and that's the hardest part. I just have to live with it, knowing that place still stands there, dark and hollow, and maybe still watching. Story 9. I remember it was 1996, late summer, and I'd driven out near Harristown, Wisconsin, to this secluded place called Lake Pignan. I'd been there once the afternoon before, just to fish and clear my head. The lake was quiet, surrounded by these towering pines, and there was something about its stillness that got under my skin. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There were no birds singing, no insects buzzing, just this eerie silence that made my stomach tighten. I ended up leaving before dark that first time, uneasy, but with no real evidence that anything was wrong. The next morning, I convinced a buddy of mine named Allah to join me. We both liked the outdoors, and he was curious about why I seemed so unsettled when I described the lake. We figured we'd set up a small camp, maybe snap a few photos, see if we could figure out what was going on. I remember packing light, just some basic fishing gear, a small tent, a couple of flashlights, and an old camera I had in my truck. The place looked normal enough in daylight. The surface of the lake was still, reflecting the bright sky. There was a light breeze, so at least we had some rustling in the branches. But as we paddled our small canoe across, that feeling returned. The quiet didn't go away entirely, but it was different, like we'd entered a bubble of silence. At one point, Allah and I glanced at each other, both trying to play it off, but we could sense it. Something about the atmosphere wasn't right. We reached a small, pebbly shore on the opposite side, where the pines were denser and the undergrowth was thick and dark. Right away, I noticed these weird branch breaks, like thick limbs twisted and snapped at about my chest height. I know how branches break naturally from storms or weight, but these looked deliberate, fresh splits, wood fibers splayed out oddly. Not far from there, we found large footprints in the dirt near some moss-covered rocks. They were longer than any human foot I'd ever seen, and deep enough to suggest something incredibly heavy. We didn't talk much. We just stared at them. My heart was pounding, and I could feel sweat prickling at my hairline even though it wasn't hot. We set up a small campsite a bit away from the tracks, closer to the lake's edge, figuring if something large was roaming around, maybe we'd be safer where the trees weren't so dense. The afternoon passed slowly. We tried fishing but barely got a nibble. We kept glancing back at the tree line, feeling eyes on us. Every now and then, the breeze would stop dead and the place would feel choked with tension. I wanted to leave, but we'd agreed to stay until morning to get a better picture of what was going on. I still remember checking my watch every hour or so, counting down until sunrise. As the sun started to dip below the pines, the silence deepened. We ate a quick dinner of canned beans and crackers, then settled into our tent with flashlights and my camera close by. We'd planned to sleep, but neither of us was really comfortable enough to rest. Night fell fast, and without any artificial light, we were depending on our flashlights and the faint glow of distant stars. Around midnight, maybe a bit later, we started hearing it. Footsteps, heavy ones, crunching through brush, snapping small twigs. They weren't steady footsteps like a person walking. It was more like something large shifting its weight from time to time, moving closer in intervals, stopping just when we thought we'd pinned down the direction. I tried to breathe quietly, and I could hear Ayla doing the same. We were both straining to listen, silently agreeing not to make noise. Then there was this breathing sound, deep and thick, like the lungs of something massive. It wasn't a growl or a roar, just this heavy, moist breathing. Every hair on my body stood on end. I've been around bears in my life, heard them snorting and stomping, but this didn't sound like that. It sounded almost human, but larger and heavier than any person I've ever encountered. We waited what felt like hours, just stiff in our sleeping bags, flashlights off because we were too scared to flick them on and reveal our presence. Finally, we decided to look. Allah nudged me and pointed at the tent's flap. Very slowly, I reached over and opened it a few inches. I aimed the flashlight beam toward the trees. All we saw were dark silhouettes of branches, the shapes of bushes, the trunk of a pine. Nothing moved, but the breathing had stopped, and that was almost worse. We sat there, peering out, when suddenly a stick snapped loudly behind our tent. I whipped the flashlight around, shaking so bad the beam danced all over the place. No eyeshine, no visible figure, just the hint of something huge slipping behind a tree. I swear I caught a glimpse of a broad, shaggy form, dark against the darker forest. I tried to snap a photo, but my hand was trembling, and the shot came out blurry. Allah muttered something under his breath, too low for me to catch, but I knew he was as freaked out as I was. We didn't sleep at all. We just sat there, listening, as whatever it was circled around, moving in and out of earshot. Sometimes we heard branches bend, other times just that thumping sound of heavy footsteps, and occasionally a soft grunt or exhale. It felt like it was toying with us, curious but cautious. I kept imagining this thing stepping into the open, letting us see it fully, and that thought made my chest tighten. I didn't want to see it. I was terrified of what it would look like. As the sky began to lighten, maybe around 5 in the morning, we decided we couldn't stay another second. We quickly packed up our gear, stumbling around in that half-light, expecting at any moment to feel a massive hand clamp down on a shoulder or to hear a roar behind us. But nothing happened. Just as we finished packing, the forest went quiet again. Not just normal quiet, almost like a held breath. We hurried toward the path that led back to the dirt road, glancing over our shoulders, sweating despite the morning chill. Before we left the area completely, I looked back at the lake. There was a faint mist on the water's surface. Everything looked so calm, like any normal morning in the woods. No sign of the footsteps, no sign of those monstrous prints, no sound of heavy breathing. Allah and I made it to the dirt road, got into my truck, and drove straight back to Harristown without saying much. The moment we hit the main road, it was as if we'd left that strange bubble behind. Birds were chirping. A couple of early risers were out on their porches. It felt surreal. We ended up telling a few local authorities what happened. They humored us, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. A few officers took a look around later that week, found nothing. No footprints, no claw marks, nothing that would confirm our story. Some people we talked to admitted they'd heard rumors for years, something lurking around Lake Pignan, but no one had solid proof. We sure didn't. Just some blurry photos that looked like smudges, and our shaky voices describing what we felt and heard. To this day, I still can't explain it. I've camped in plenty of places, encountered wildlife that can be unsettling, but I've never experienced anything like that night at Lake Pignan. The silence, the footprints, that heavy breathing right outside the tent. It wasn't normal. Whatever was out there didn't want to show itself fully, and that somehow made it worse. It felt older and smarter than a bear or a moose, more aware of our presence than we were of its. I can't prove it. I can't say for sure it was a Bigfoot or anything else people whisper about in hushed tones. All I know is that we felt it. We know it was there, watching us, creeping around just beyond the beam of our flashlights. Even now, when I think back on it, I get chills. I never went back to Lake Pignan after that. Allah didn't either. We just avoid talking about it with people who'll roll their eyes. But I remember every second of that night, and no matter how many years pass, I still don't have a reasonable explanation. It just happened, and then it stopped. And I'm pretty sure I'll never really understand what we encountered out there. Story 10. I remember it was late autumn of 1978, just a few days after I arrived at the old Henderson farm in Clearwater, Montana. My uncle had passed away, and I'd come to go through his things and figure out what to do with the property. The place was worn out. Old wooden planks on the porch creaked under the slightest weight, and the barn's doors were swollen with age. Everything felt heavy, quiet, and utterly isolated. There was no phone line connected at the time, and I had no truck yet, just my uncle's old station wagon that barely ran. The nearest neighbor was Esther, who lived about a mile away. I had met her briefly that afternoon. She looked worried, mentioned strange sightings. I tried to brush it off, thinking she was just feeding local legends. It got dark pretty fast that evening. The sky stained purple before fading to pitch black. I remember standing by the window in the living room. The floorboards smelled musty, and I kept hearing the distant squeak of the barn door hinges. I had taken a quick walk around the property earlier and found broken branches behind the barn and odd claw marks on the wooden door. I told myself it must have been a bear, but something felt off. Those branches were snapped in a way I'd never really seen, twisted rather than just broken, and the claw marks were too high and too deliberate. Still, I tried to stay rational. Inside, I had only a couple of oil lamps and some old flashlights. No electricity. I kept one lamp near the window so I could at least see out into the yard. There was barely any wind that night. It was one of those evenings where even the distant rustle of grass seemed too loud. I strained my ears, thinking I might catch the sound of deer or maybe a raccoon. For a while, nothing. Just silence. Then I heard it. Slow, heavy footsteps outside, somewhere near the barn. Not the soft padding of a four-legged animal, but something else. They were deliberate, crunching the loose gravel and old dry grass in a rhythm that suggested weight and height. I froze, leaning forward to peer through the window. The moon was bright enough that I could make out silhouettes and shapes. I waited, heart pounding, wondering if I should grab my uncle's old rifle, which I'd propped against the kitchen wall. I held back, because I still thought it might be some large animal, maybe a bear on its hind legs. But deep down, I felt that sickening twist in my gut telling me this wasn't normal. As I stared outside, I spotted something tall moving between the shadows, right where the fence posts stood in a line near the barn. It was so tall it almost seemed level with the top of the fence, and it moved with a strange, upright gait. My hand started shaking. I felt sweat trickle down the back of my neck, even though it was actually pretty cold inside. The thing stopped near the barn, and I swear I saw the barn door tremble slightly, as if nudged. Then it leaned forward, almost like it was listening or sniffing. I remember thinking, this can't be real, but it was happening right in front of my eyes. I struggled to make out details. The creature was covered in dark hair, not glossy but kind of rough and uneven from what I could tell by the moonlight. Its shoulders were broad, and it stood fully upright, no slouching like a bear might do. I didn't see a face clearly, but I could sense its head turning, scanning the area. The sound of its breathing, or maybe a low grunt, reached my ears. It was deeper and rougher than any animal I'd heard before. It didn't howl or roar. It made these short, heavy exhalations. Just that was enough to send a jolt of fear right into my chest. I thought about Esther's words earlier in the day. She'd told me people had claimed to see something strange roaming around here, something they couldn't quite identify. She never claimed it was Bigfoot outright, just said it was some sort of, I don't know, a creature. I had laughed it off internally, but now I stood there, terrified, unable to deny that something unknown was right there on the property. For a few minutes, I watched this thing. It moved from the barn towards the corral fence, pausing at intervals as if aware someone might be watching. I tried to stay absolutely still, but my elbow accidentally bumped the lamp on the windowsill. It made a tiny clang, and in that instant, I saw the creature's silhouette jerk around to face my direction. My heart almost stopped. I ducked down, crouching below the window, desperate to slow my breathing. The house was nearly silent, except for the faint buzzing in my ears from sheer panic. After maybe a minute, I dared to peek again. The silhouette was gone. My eyes darted across the yard, the barn, the fence line. Nothing. I waited, feeling a dread that's hard to put into words. It wasn't just fear. It was that sinking sensation you get when you realize you might be dealing with something beyond your understanding. I thought about running outside to the car and leaving, but the keys were on the kitchen table, and I'd have to cross the whole living room to get there. Even if I got to the car, where would I go in the middle of the night in rural Montana with no phone and no idea if that thing would chase me? So I stayed put, gripping the windowsill until my knuckles ached. Time crawled by. I listened for those footsteps again, but heard nothing. I began to wonder if I'd imagined it all, but I knew I hadn't. I decided to move to the back door and lock it, even though the lock was just an old latch. As I crossed the room, something scratched at the barn door again, that distinct scraping sound. It made my skin crawl. I don't know if the creature was still there or if I was hearing an echo of what happened before. Every small noise seemed amplified, every shadow suspicious. Eventually, maybe an hour or two passed. I'm not sure, I didn't keep track. I didn't dare turn on my flashlight. I just sat quietly in a corner of the living room, occasionally peering out. The moon shifted positions, casting different shadows. I thought I saw movement at the tree line behind the barn, a quick flash of something tall ducking between the trunks. I held my breath, muscles tense, ready to hear a window break or a door slam open. But it never came inside. Whatever it was, it stayed outside, lurking, watching. At some point I must have dozed off or lost track of time in my terrified state. When the faint light of dawn finally touched the horizon, the yard looked empty, just as it had the day before. Nothing moved. My legs were stiff from crouching. With shaky steps, I went outside to check. The barn door had new scratches, not deep, but fresh and parallel, like something with large hands had tried to feel its way around the edge. The ground had impressions, not clear footprints like you'd see in a cast, but heavy, distinct depressions that seemed too large and oddly shaped to be human. The fencing had one rail twisted just like those branches I'd found earlier. I felt sick to my stomach. I had no camera on hand, nothing to prove what I'd seen. Esther would probably believe me, but that was it. Who else would? I knew what I witnessed wasn't a trick of the light or a bear rummaging for food. I wasn't drunk or half asleep. This happened before my eyes. Whatever it was real, it was big, and it moved with intelligence and purpose. Even now, I can't say what that creature was. Some people might call it Bigfoot, others might think I'm making it up, but I was there, scared out of my mind in that old farmhouse, hearing those footsteps, seeing that tall silhouette under the moonlight. It never directly attacked me, never tried to break down the door or anything like that. It just made its presence known, left marks, and vanished into the darkness. I stayed at the farm for a while after that, but I never felt truly safe. I tried again to convince myself it was some uncommon animal, maybe a freakishly large bear, just my imagination running wild, but I know what I saw, and the fact that it never returned in such an obvious way after that night, that it came and went so abruptly, still rattles me to this day. It showed up, let me know it was there, and then disappeared into the hills. No explanation, no second encounter that was as clear as that one. just one night of terror and confusion, and then life went on, leaving me with questions I'll probably never answer. Story 11. I remember that day in 1982 like it just happened. I had left my place early in the morning, feeling kind of fed up with my usual routine. I needed a break from my life in Strangeville, Pennsylvania, and decided to wander along this remote part of the local trail. I knew it was a stretch of the Appalachians that most people ignored. The area was thick with brush, uneven ground, and there were tons of reasons to avoid it. It wasn't friendly to hikers, and locals rarely bothered going that deep. But I guess I was looking for something, anything, to shake up that dull feeling I'd been stuck in. I remember walking for a couple of hours through relatively familiar territory before drifting off into that secluded patch. The deeper I went, the quieter everything got, and not just quiet like a normal forest. The silence out there was wrong. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. Normally, you'd at least hear birds or the buzz of insects, but it was dead silent. Even my own footsteps sounded muted, like the forest was swallowing all noise. After a while, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Trees that looked twisted, as if their trunks had been wrenched around by giant hands. I hadn't seen anything like that before. The bark had strange scratches in it, arranged in odd patterns. They weren't the kind of marks a bear's claws would make. They were bigger, spaced strangely, almost like they'd been etched with intention. As I kept walking, I found more unsettling stuff. Some branches were broken too high off the ground to be normal storm damage, and there were places where the underbrush seemed flattened, not in random spots, but in areas that formed a kind of path. At some point, I began to feel this intense pressure around me, like I wasn't alone. I know it sounds cliché, but I swear it felt like something was watching me. My neck was prickling, and my breathing got heavier. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe I'd spooked myself with all the weird sights. But then I caught a whiff of something foul, like a mix of wet dog and decay. It wasn't constant, but it would drift in and out with the breeze. Eventually I stumbled onto an old cabin. It was tucked in a spot where the trees grew thick and crooked, and the roof had partially collapsed. The door was ajar, hanging on rusted hinges. I'd heard rumors there were old homesteads scattered around these woods, places left behind when families moved out decades ago. Still, seeing it there, so isolated and rotten, made me uneasy. My gut told me not to go inside, but I was desperate for some kind of clue, maybe some old signs that could explain what was going on. Inside, it was dark and smelled like damp earth and mold. Dust particles hung in the air, and my boots sank slightly into the dirt floor. There were a few old tools strewn around, a broken table, and some shelves that looked like they might collapse if I touched them. When I bent down to look more closely at the floor, that's when I noticed them, footprints or something like footprints. They were huge and oddly shaped, definitely not made by a regular boot or even a bare human foot. The toes, if you can call them that, were spaced strangely, and the impression suggested something heavy had been here. The prints were not fresh, but they weren't ancient either. I brushed some loose dirt out of one to see better, and that's when I heard a low, distant growl outside. My blood ran cold. I can't describe that sound properly. It was like a bear's roar, but not quite. Deeper, more resonant, with a strange pattern to it. I froze, and for a second I couldn't breathe. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear or a mountain lion. But it didn't fit. My heart was pounding so hard I swear it shook my chest. I wanted out of there fast. I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes on the cabin's interior, half expecting something to jump out from a dark corner. But nothing moved inside. Once I was out, the silence was back. But now it was tense. I could feel eyes on me, feel something waiting in that tangled mess of trees. I started walking quickly, trying to retrace my steps. The trail, which had been somewhat clear before, now felt impossible to follow. Every direction looked the same: thick vegetation, old twisted trees, and barely any landmarks. I was trying hard not to panic, but I kept thinking about those footprints and the smell. The forest felt like it was alive and angry. I tried to keep my breathing steady, focusing on getting the hell out of there. Then I heard movement behind me, heavy steps snapping twigs and rustling leaves. They sounded deliberate, not some deer passing by. I forced myself not to run immediately. Running blind in those woods would have been a terrible idea. But I picked up the pace, and as I moved faster, the steps quickened too. The worst part was that I couldn't get a good look at it. The creature stayed off to my side, behind thick vegetation, always just out of clear view. I caught maybe a glimpse, a towering shape covered in dark hair. I remember seeing a massive arm or shoulder through some branches. I can't say I saw its face clearly, but the outline was enough to make my heart nearly stop. It was big, at least 7 or 8 feet tall. The shoulders were broad, and it moved with a strange, smooth gait. It wasn't charging me, it was tracking me, following me, and that was somehow more terrifying. I tried to speed up, stumbled over a root, and fell face first into wet dirt. My palms stung, and my knee ached as I scrambled to get back on my feet. That's when I glanced to my left and saw it for a fraction of a second. It stood partially behind a tree trunk, blending into the shadows, but I swear I saw 2 eyes reflecting what little light came through the canopy. They weren't glowing or anything fantastical, just reflecting like an animal's eyes at dusk. But those eyes were set in a face that looked too human and too animal at the same time. It was like my brain couldn't settle on what I was looking at. I panicked and ran. I didn't know if I was going the right way, or if I was pushing myself deeper into its territory. Branches scratched my arms, and I kept tripping over roots and rocks. For what felt like hours, I moved as fast as I could, expecting at any moment for it to close in. But it didn't. I kept hearing it behind me, sometimes parallel to me, always just out of sight. I felt trapped in some twisted game of cat and mouse. Then, all of a sudden, the forest started to feel different. I emerged into a slightly more open area, and I noticed the normal sounds returning, distant chirps of birds and a gentle breeze that made the leaves rustle. I can't explain it, but it felt like I had crossed an invisible boundary. The oppressive feeling lightened. The smell faded. The heavy footsteps stopped. When I turned around to look, there was nothing there. No figure, no movement in the brush. It was like it decided I had left its domain, and it let me go. I was shaking so badly I could barely walk straight, but I kept moving until I found a familiar portion of the main trail. By late afternoon, I made it back to Strangeville. I told a couple of people what I'd seen. Most gave me skeptical looks. A few said they'd heard weird rumors over the years. Strange footprints found by hunters, weird cries at night, stories passed around campfires. But no one had any concrete proof. Some hinted at a wild man or a Bigfoot in those hills, but always with a laugh or a shrug. I remember feeling frustrated and scared, realizing I'd probably never be able to convince anyone fully. I didn't have a camera with me. I didn't take any cast of the footprints. I just had my story and the fear that still kept me awake at night. I never went back there. To this day, I can't fully make sense of it. Maybe it was a Bigfoot-like creature, something that lives deep in the Appalachians, avoiding human contact. Maybe it was just my imagination spiraling out of control. But something was out there, something real enough to leave footprints, break branches, and watch me from the shadows. I still get goosebumps when I think about it. The forest near Strangeville looked normal enough from a distance, but after what I experienced, I'm certain it holds secrets that most people don't even realize exist. It never happened to me again. It was just that one day, and then everything went back to normal. But every once in a while, I wake up sweating, thinking about those eyes in the woods and that silence pressing down on me. And I know I'm not making this up. I know what I felt and what I saw, even if I can't explain it, and I've never been the same since. Story 12. I remember that day in 1988 like it just happened yesterday. Back then, I was living in a cramped apartment in Charleston, working a job I hated, and always feeling anxious about everything. I needed a break. I'd heard about Larb Forest near Millfield, a quiet spot with nice trails, some rare birds, and streams that people said were crystal clear. It sounded like exactly what I needed. Just me, my camera, and a long walk, maybe a chance to feel human again. I parked my old car on the edge of a dirt road leading into the forest. The trailhead wasn't anything special, just a gap between trees, a small wooden sign, and a narrow path. But as soon as I stepped under the canopy, I felt a difference in the air. There was this odd humidity, not the regular summer stuff, but a kind of heavy dampness that carried a strange smell. Not rotten exactly, but a sour, metallic tang that I couldn't place. At first it was okay. I walked for maybe half an hour, snapping a few pictures, moss-covered logs, some vibrant mushrooms, a hawk perched high up in a dead tree. I was trying to relax. The silence was intense, though. I mean, forests are quiet places, but they're never silent. You always hear something. Birds, insects, rustling leaves. Here, it was way too quiet. Like the place was holding its breath, waiting. I tried to ignore it, telling myself maybe it was just a slow day for wildlife. I kept going deeper, following a faint path that branched off from the main trail. It led me into a denser section of the woods where the sunlight barely got through. The ground was soft and muddy in places, and I had to step carefully. After a while, I reached this small clearing, nothing big, just enough space for some sunlight to fall in and light up the ground. And that's when I saw them. Bones scattered all over. Some looked like deer bones or maybe a bear's, long, thick pieces. But mixed in, there were smaller ones, odd shapes I couldn't identify. They were just lying there, bleached in some parts, cracked in others. I froze. It's not that unusual to find remains in a forest. Predators do their thing, but something about this felt off. There were too many fragments, too scattered, and some looked like they'd been snapped in half, not chewed, more like torn apart. My stomach twisted. I didn't want to be around that, but I was curious and a bit freaked out. I leaned down and noticed strange footprints in the damp earth. They were long, too long for a human foot, and deep, as if whatever made them was incredibly heavy. I'm not talking about just a large man's boot. These were shaped weird, like an elongated print with toes that seemed too spread out. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I tried to dismiss it as maybe a bear standing funny or something, but it didn't match any bear tracks I'd seen in books. The spacing suggested a stride longer than any human's, and the depth of the imprints was disturbing. Something massive had walked here, recently enough to leave fresh prints in the soft ground. While I was still crouched down, that's when I first heard it. A low, rolling growl that seemed to vibrate through the trees. I whipped my head around, but I couldn't tell which direction it came from. It was just there, hanging in the thick air, making my heart race. The silence that followed was even worse. I stood up slowly, my knees shaking a bit, and tried to focus on my surroundings. My camera was around my neck, but I wasn't thinking about taking pictures anymore. I was thinking about getting the hell out of there. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Just a wall of green, shadows dancing as the breeze moved leaves slightly. But the weird thing was, there wasn't much wind that day. The leaves were barely moving. The branches above me were almost still. That growl. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. Bears have a certain tone. Bobcats have that scream-like call. This was different. more like something large, deep-chested, and maybe even irritated that I was there. I started walking back the way I came, trying to keep quiet. Every twig I stepped on made me flinch, but the forest seemed to close in around me. I noticed fewer and fewer signs of normal life. No birdsong, no squirrel chatter. Just that stale, heavy quiet and that weird smell. At one point, I stumbled slightly, and when I looked down, I saw another one of those footprints near a patch of ferns. This one was clearer, and I swear it looked like it had toes, huge toes. 5 of them. A bizarre shape, not exactly like a human foot and not like a bear's paw either. It was longer, with some strange spacing. I followed its direction with my eyes and felt as if something was watching me from behind the trunks. A prickly sensation crawled up the back of my neck. I sped up, but not too much. I didn't want to run and draw attention. I just wanted to get back to a real trail, something more traveled. After maybe 15 minutes, I finally found a dirt path, wider and more beaten down. I recognized it, one of those paths hunters sometimes use. My relief was immediate. I could follow it back to the main trail and then to my car. I took a few steps onto it and looked over my shoulder, expecting to see something burst out of the greenery. But nothing happened. The forest remained still, quiet and suffocating. That's when I saw a shape. Not clearly, not in detail, just this large, dark figure darting behind a thick tree trunk. It was tall and broad, covered in dark hair or fur, and it moved smoothly, not crashing through the underbrush. It was like it knew exactly how to navigate those woods without making a sound. I swear it was there. I froze, heart pounding in my ears. I wanted to raise my camera, but my hands were shaking. By the time I steadied myself and aimed, there was nothing, just empty space. For a moment, I thought maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, but I know what I saw. It was big, too big to be a man in some costume, and it moved in a way I can't fully explain, fast, quiet, and deliberate. I kept going, now more terrified than before. Every few steps, I'd pause and listen, expecting another growl or rustle. I only heard once more that faint sound, a branch snapping far behind me. It sounded heavy, like something stepping in the wrong spot. After that, nothing else but my own breathing and heartbeat. I was covered in sweat, my shirt sticking to my back. I tried to move quickly but as silently as possible. Even the crunch of leaves under my boots made me wince. Eventually, I recognized a familiar oak with a chunk of bark missing near its base. That meant I was about 10 minutes from the edge of the forest. I picked up the pace, practically jogging at some points. The weird smell faded as I went farther from the clearing. The air got lighter. Soon, I could hear a distant car engine from a far-off road. I felt safer with every step. When I finally reached the spot where my car was parked, I felt like I'd escaped some kind of trap. I threw my gear in, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. I just sat there trying to calm down. My hands were trembling so much I could barely get the key in the ignition. Once I got moving, I headed straight into Millfield and found a local cop to tell him what happened. I tried to be calm, but I must have sounded crazy, talking about weird footprints, bones, a giant hairy figure lurking in the forest. He gave me a look that said he didn't believe a word of it. He took some notes, told me to be careful, and that was about it. Later, when I mentioned this at a small diner, some old-timers gave me strange looks. They mumbled something about old stories and local legends. I picked up hints about folks sometimes going missing or finding strange signs in Larb Forest, but no one would talk openly. It was like a taboo subject. Without photos, my camera had useless shots of mushrooms and moss, nothing else. I had no proof. I felt frustrated and freaked out at the same time. I never went back there. Just thinking about that place makes my skin crawl. Whatever I encountered that day, whatever left those prints and scattered those bones, it's still out there as far as I know, It didn't roar or charge me, but it sure let me know I wasn't welcome. The silence, the smell, the massive shape moving just out of sight. It was all real to me, as real as the sweat that trickled down my face and the tremble in my legs as I made my escape. To this day, I can't explain it. I don't have a neat ending or a dramatic confrontation. It started as a peaceful hike and ended with me feeling like I'd just walked out of a nightmare. I think about it sometimes and wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed longer, if I'd tried to take a clear photo, if I'd gotten closer to those footprints. But I didn't. I left, and I never saw it again. Sometimes the world doesn't give us answers. It just hands us a memory so vivid that we can't shake it, no matter how hard we try. It's something I'll carry with me forever. Story 13. I remember it happened back in late September 1995, right at the edge of Willowbrook Nature Preserve near Randall, Colorado. I was working as a ranger there, had been for years, so I knew the area pretty well. That day started like any other, checking the trails, making sure everything was safe for visitors. But the last few weeks had been weird. People were coming back from hikes spooked, talking about strange noises at night, and a few even claimed they caught a glimpse of something big and hairy running between the trees. It sounded like nonsense, but we'd found some strange footprints, huge, deep prints that didn't match any animal we knew. Plus, the scratch marks on the trees were higher up than any bear could reach. It put everyone on edge. I tried not to let it get to me. I'd seen my share of wildlife out there, bears, elk, mountain lions, and never had I felt this odd tension in the preserve. We're talking about a place that's supposed to be peaceful, well-maintained and safe. Usually the worst I had to deal with was a careless camper leaving food out or someone twisting an ankle. But now I was on patrol carrying a rifle, which I normally never did unless I had a specific reason. That day, I felt I had to. Late afternoon, my colleague Cassidy joined me. She was as experienced as I was, and neither of us liked the stories floating around. We decided to focus on the isolated area where most of these sightings were reported. This spot was off the main trails, thick with older trees and fewer visitors. It was quiet, too quiet. Even the birds seemed reluctant to make noise. By the time we got there, the sun was going down, and the place got a heavy, uneasy feeling. The kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up. We moved slowly, trying to find fresh signs. It didn't take long before we noticed more strange details. Some branches snapped way too high up, deep grooves in the bark that looked like claw marks. And when I say grooves, I mean something had really dug in, leaving long, uneven scratches about 8 or 9 feet off the ground. A bear could stand on its hind legs, but these scratches, I don't know, they just didn't match what I'd seen before. As dusk settled, we heard it, a low, guttural growl echoing through the trees. It wasn't constant, more like a short, deep rumble that stopped as soon as we paused to listen. Cassidy looked at me, and I could see she was rattled. I tried to keep my cool, but my heart was racing. I aimed my flashlight towards the direction of the noise, and the beam caught just the dense undergrowth and tall pines. Nothing moved, but I could feel we weren't alone. We pressed on, following the sound. After a few more steps, we came across something that froze me in place. Fresh prints, enormous footprints pressed into the damp soil. They looked human-like, but way bigger. And not just bigger, wider, deeper. The stride length was massive, too. Whatever made them had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. I crouched down to get a closer look, shining my flashlight over the edges of the print. It was well-defined, toes and all, unlike a boot print. I felt a chill in my spine. I've never believed in Bigfoot-type legends, but nothing else fit. We kept going, and then we heard that growl again, this time much closer. Then a series of heavy steps, like something large was circling us. The trees were so dense that the flashlight only caught glimpses of movement. Branches swaying, a flash of something dark moving just beyond my field of vision. I tried calling out, hoping to scare it off, but my voice cracked. Cassidy gripped her rifle tighter, and I could see sweat on her forehead even though it was getting cold. Then we caught a partial view. Just for a split second, my flashlight hit it. An upright figure, huge, covered in dark, matted hair. It was hunched forward, and its eyes caught the light for a moment, reflecting a dull glow. It vanished behind a cluster of pines before I could fully register what I was seeing. My stomach dropped. I'd never felt fear like that before. It wasn't just an animal. Something about the way it moved and watched us felt all wrong. Intelligent, cautious, maybe even curious, but definitely territorial. I raised my rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The blast echoed so loudly that my ears rang. Everything went silent afterward. For a moment, I thought maybe we scared it off. But just as we started to relax, I heard branches snapping behind us. I spun around with my flashlight, but by the time the beam caught the spot, all I saw was some leaves settling and a quick blur of something large slipping back into the darkness. It was messing with us, moving fast, circling, never giving us a clear look. I wanted to get the hell out of there, but I also wanted proof. People had been scared to come here. Maybe if we had something tangible, we could close off the area, warn people properly, or get the wildlife department to believe us. But I realized, standing there with Cassidy, heart pounding and hands sweating on the rifle's grip, that we were in over our heads. We tried the radio. Static. We were too far in, and the terrain made the signal weak. We caught maybe a word or two. Nothing clear. If something went wrong, we were on our own. Cassidy whispered that we should head back. I agreed. We took a different route out, trying to move quickly but quietly. Every few steps, I'd hear something following us. Twigs snapping, a heavy breath. I'd whirl around with the flashlight and see nothing. But I felt it was there, always out of sight, just at the edge of the beam. After what felt like hours, we emerged back onto a more familiar trail. The tension eased slightly, but I still felt like something was watching from the tree line. We didn't say much to each other. We just kept moving. By the time we got back to the visitor center, the sky was turning a pale gray, almost dawn. We were both drained, shaky, and honestly, more confused than ever. We told the rest of the team what we'd encountered. No one laughed. They'd seen the strange footprints before, heard the rumors, and knew we weren't the type to make up stories. A couple of guys went out later that morning to check the area thoroughly. They found some broken branches, some weird markings, but no footprints this time, just faint impressions that could have been anything. No fur, no blood, nothing concrete. The strangest thing was how that tension seemed to vanish during the day. The woods looked normal, calm. The few people who were around didn't notice anything unusual, but I knew what I saw. I knew what I felt. Cassidy wouldn't even talk much about it afterward. It was like we both realized there's something out there that we don't have an explanation for, something smart and elusive that owns those woods at night. I still think about that encounter. We never got a second look at that creature, never found a clear trail or solid evidence. It was just that one long, terrifying night where it revealed itself to us in fragments. To this day, I can't explain it. I know what's supposed to live in those woods and what isn't. And that thing, it isn't supposed to exist. But somehow it does. Or did. After that night, the strange sightings tapered off. The preserve went back to being quiet and safe, at least on the surface. But I never forgot, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I don't have a neat ending or a clever twist. All I have is the memory of something I can't explain, lurking out there in the dark, waiting, watching. It came and went without leaving a solid trace, and that's the part that still makes my skin crawl. Story 14. I remember that morning in 1993 so vividly, I still get knots in my stomach when I think about it. I'd headed out before sunrise near Ashley Springs, close to Banff National Park in Canada. My plan was to capture some rare wildlife shots, maybe a moose or a couple of shy deer. Back then, I was equipped with a Nikon F4 camera, a decent telephoto lens, and a sturdy tripod. The air was crisp, the kind that pinches your nose and makes your breath hover in front of your face. The forest around that area always felt calm, almost soothing. I'd been there many times and never had any reason to feel uneasy, but that day, things just felt off. First, I noticed the absolute silence. It wasn't just quiet. It was like the entire forest had hit the mute button. Normally, at that hour, you'd hear something. The crackle of small critters, birds calling out, maybe squirrels scrambling along branches. But it was dead still. It took me a few minutes to really register that. I thought maybe I'd just gotten lucky and the animals were giving me a chance to set up without startling them. Still, the silence pressed on me in a weird way. After about half an hour, I came across a clearing where I usually spot deer. Instead of seeing grazing animals or at least tracks in the early morning dew, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. A deer carcass, torn open in a way I'd never seen before. I've photographed predators and their kills before. I know what it looks like when a bear takes down a deer. There's a certain pattern to it. But this was different. Parts of the deer were scattered in a messy, almost careless manner. The ribs looked like they'd been twisted apart. The smell hit me next, a thick, metallic tang mixed with this old, rancid odor, like something that had been left in a cellar too long. I gagged and stepped back. I tried to shake it off, telling myself maybe a bear had gotten aggressive, or a cougar, but something about it just seemed off. As I moved on, carefully stepping around the patches of blood, I noticed large impressions in the soft ground. They weren't neat footprints like a boot, and they were too big and oddly shaped to be from a bear. They looked like enormous human-like footprints, but with a wider shape and toes that seemed to splay out. I crouched down to examine them, my heart thumping. I reached out and touched the edges. The prints were deep, meaning whatever made them was heavy. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe some kind of hoax, or a misinterpretation of overlapping bear tracks. But then I heard it, a low, grumbling growl from somewhere behind me. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My mouth went dry. I spun around, expecting to see a bear, but there was nothing. Just the dark silhouettes of towering conifers. The smell seemed stronger now, and I realized it wasn't just coming from the carcass, it was lingering in the air, following me. I slowly got up, trying not to make any sudden moves. I had no phone signal out there. This was 93, and even if I'd had a cell, the reception would have been a joke. So I was alone, and if something was stalking me, I had no backup. I forced myself to breathe through my mouth and keep moving. I veered off my original path, thinking I could loop around toward a more open part of the valley. Maybe I could find a familiar trail marker or get back to where a few other photographers sometimes gathered. But every time I tried to listen for normal forest sounds, I got nothing but my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. That's when I heard a series of heavy steps, twigs snapping like dry spaghetti, branches rustling as if something very large was pushing through them. It was behind me and catching up fast. I broke into a run, my boots slipping on moss and damp ground. My tripod banged against my shoulder, and I nearly lost my camera strap from around my neck. I looked back just once and saw it. A massive, upright figure covered in dark hair. It moved in a way that wasn't clumsy, but it wasn't smooth either. It just moved with this strange, heavy purpose. Its outline was huge, at least a head taller than a big man, and its arms hung low. I couldn't make out the face clearly, but I saw a hint of eyes shining in the low light, reflecting something: intelligence, maybe curiosity, or worse, some kind of hunger. I tried to raise my camera, but my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't focus. My finger fumbled on the shutter, and I clicked anyway, hoping maybe I'd catch something. But I'm sure the photos ended up blurred nonsense. The creature stopped for a moment, watching me. I could feel it sizing me up. My legs were trembling, and the smell in the air was even stronger now, almost choking. I did something I never thought I'd do. I screamed, just a raw, terrified shout. For a split second, the thing seemed to flinch, as if it hadn't expected that. Maybe it was used to animals running silently, not a human yelling right at it. That hesitation was all I needed. I bolted, ignoring the branches, scratching my face and tearing at my jacket. I slipped once and banged my knee hard on a root, but I kept going. My mind was racing. This was not a bear. It was not a moose. It was something else entirely. Something I had always thought was just a campfire story or a local legend. I'd heard whispers in town about strange sightings, but I'd always rolled my eyes at that stuff. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I burst out onto a more familiar trail. After a few more minutes, I came across a small group of hikers. They must have thought I'd lost my mind, sweaty, shaking, breathing like I'd just outrun a grizzly. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but I barely made sense. Some of them gave me that look people give when they think you're either drunk or lying. A couple looked nervous, like maybe there was a dangerous animal around. When I calmed down enough, I managed to lead them back a short distance, trying to point out where I'd been, but I didn't dare go too deep again. We didn't see anything then, just the disturbed underbrush and a few odd footprints in the mud that no one could identify. They looked at the footprints and whispered among themselves, but no one had a good explanation. Some took pictures, but honestly, they just looked like weird smudges in the dirt once you tried to make sense of them. Later, the park authorities came out. They listened to my story, though I could see in their eyes they were skeptical. They did find evidence of that deer carcass, though, and a trail of dried blood leading deeper into the forest. They found strange tracks, too, but nothing conclusive. Bears can leave odd prints when their front and rear paws overlap, they said. Cougars and wolves usually have a certain kill pattern, but no one had seen a kill quite like that, or tracks so oddly shaped. Still, they didn't commit to any explanation. By the time I got back to Ashley Springs, news had already started spreading. Some people shook their heads at me. Others told me they remembered old stories passed down by their grandparents, stories about hairy, man-like creatures seen on rare occasions in these woods. I'd never paid attention before. Now I couldn't get it out of my mind. I tried to develop the shots from my camera, hoping maybe I'd caught something. But the few frames I snapped while panicking were useless. Blurry trees, a smear of darkness that could have been anything, and a whole lot of nothing. It frustrated me. I wanted proof. I know what I saw. It wasn't a hallucination or a trick of the light. I'll never forget the size of that thing, the smell, the way it felt like the forest was holding its breath. It didn't behave like a normal animal. It felt too aware, almost too controlled. I've never felt that kind of fear before or since. Even now, after all these years, I can't explain it. I can't wrap my head around the idea that something so large and so strange could be out there, just vanishing back into the trees as if nothing happened. Looking back, I realize how lucky I was. It could have easily caught me if it really wanted to. Maybe my scream confused it, or maybe I just wasn't worth the trouble. I never went that deep into the woods alone again. I still shoot wildlife, but I'm more cautious, more aware of the silence and the smells. What happened that day just started and ended all in that strange stretch of forest. One moment I was a skeptic, trying to get a perfect shot of a deer in early light, and the next I was running for my life from something I never believed could exist. To this day, I have no neat explanation. The memory still haunts me, and I can't deny what I experienced. It simply came and went like a nightmare that left no neat answers, only questions and a lingering sense of unease that I've never really shaken off. Story 15. I remember it was early autumn of 1991, somewhere near Summerfield, Arizona, when I agreed to tag along with Roderick and Rucker to Keem's Canyon. They had been there before and claimed they'd seen signs of something big, something that wasn't supposed to be out there. I was skeptical. I was a journalist at the time, Miles Henderson, freshly looking for a story that would stand out. They told me about odd tracks and strange noises in that canyon, and I thought it would make for an interesting piece. Honestly, I didn't expect much. I figured maybe it'd turn into another article about local folklore. The drive out to the canyon was hot and dull. The road was rough, and the desert stretched out endlessly. Nothing but scrub, cactus, and dust in every direction. We finally reached the canyon area in the late morning. I felt that dry, itchy heat on my face the second I stepped out of the truck. The air tasted like sand. Everything looked so empty and lifeless. The silence had a weird weight to it, though. It wasn't the normal quiet of the desert. It felt like something was holding its breath. Roderick and Rucker pointed out footprints before I even noticed them. They looked human at first glance, but not quite right. The shape was broader, and they sank deeper into the packed earth than any normal human footprint should. I tried to laugh it off, maybe some local kids playing a prank, or a trick of the wind and sand. But Rucker swore he'd seen similar tracks here years ago. The prints stretched along the canyon floor, weaving between large rocks. I followed them with my eyes for about 20 yards before they vanished into a darker patch of stony ground. No distinct direction, no clear pattern, just there one moment and gone the next. Deeper inside the canyon, we found something else. On a softer, weathered piece of sandstone, we saw what looked like claw marks. They were arranged in 3 deep grooves, each thicker than my thumb, and set at a height I couldn't easily explain. We stood there just staring, trying to figure out what could have done that. A bear. Not in this area. A mountain lion wouldn't leave marks like that. And these weren't small scratches. They looked like something took a deliberate swipe at the rock. I tried to take photos, but the light was strange, and my camera's cheap flash wasn't helping. Still, I snapped what I could. As I fiddled with the camera, I noticed Roderick and Rucker scanning the canyon walls, their rifles slung low but ready. They weren't joking around. These guys had seen something before, and they were nervous. Then we all froze. A sound echoed through the canyon, somewhere off to our left, maybe further down. It sounded like a cry, but it was distorted, muffled. My first thought was that it was a person in trouble, but it didn't really sound human. It was too low, too drawn out, like the wind had grabbed hold of a scream and stretched it into something else. We waited, listened, but nothing else came. Without any cell reception, we relied on each other. The sun started to dip behind the canyon walls sooner than we expected. The light shifted fast, and long shadows stretched across the ground. We knew we'd have to camp if we wanted to see more. That evening, we set up a small camp under a rock overhang that offered some protection. There wasn't much comfort to be found. The darkness out there is thick, like ink. My flashlight beam caught glimpses of towering rock faces and the occasional cluster of dry bushes, but mostly just emptiness and shadow. We tried to sleep, taking turns standing watch. I remember lying on my back, my sleeping bag on that hard ground, feeling so exposed. The night air cooled down, but my skin was damp with sweat anyway. I kept hearing noises, small rocks tumbling, twigs snapping. The wind made a deep, hollow sound as it moved through the narrow canyon. At one point, I could have sworn I heard a low, rumbling growl. I shone my flashlight around, and all I saw were distorted shapes cast by the rocks. It was impossible to tell what was real and what was just my imagination on edge. Rucker whispered at some point that he smelled something rank, like wet dog fur and rotting vegetation. I didn't catch it at first, but after a while I did notice an odd, earthy odor that didn't fit the dry desert environment. It came and went too fast for me to pinpoint where it was coming from. Roderick said we should keep quiet, so we did. We just listened and waited, hearts pounding. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling longer than the last. By the time the first light crept back into the canyon, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. My muscles were stiff, my neck hurt, and my head was pounding from tension and dehydration. We got up and decided to check the perimeter. That's when we found more evidence. Right behind where we had been sleeping, there were tracks again, fresh ones. They pressed into the loose dirt, as if something heavy had been standing right behind us, maybe watching us as we slept. We also found a few dark, coarse hairs snagged on a cactus spine. They were longer than any human hair, thick and rough. I still remember how they felt between my fingers, almost like they belonged on some kind of large, wild animal, but not quite anything I recognized. That was enough for all of us. I'm not ashamed to say I felt real fear. I can't say what we encountered because we never saw it directly, but whatever it was, it moved quietly. It observed us, and it wasn't afraid to get close. We packed our gear quickly, hardly talking to each other. Nobody needed to say it out loud. We were done. We had come looking for a story, and I guess we got one, just not the kind I could easily put into words or photographs. The whole place felt hostile, as if it resented our presence. The drive back to Summerfield was tense. We kept looking in the mirrors, expecting something to follow us, but the canyon just fell away behind us, silent and empty. Back in town, we told the local authorities what we'd found: unusual footprints, weird noises, strange hair. They didn't seem shocked. Apparently, this wasn't the first time people had reported seeing something out there. Still, they never turn up any solid evidence. They do a few searches, find nothing but odd impressions in the dirt and the occasional scratch on a rock. Eventually, it all just becomes another rumor in a place that's already got its share of strange stories. I ended up writing about the experience. No solid proof, no clear photographs, just my words describing that suffocating silence, those impossible footprints, and that terrible feeling of being watched. Some people dismissed it as nonsense. Others got curious and started asking questions. All I know is that Roderick and Rucker, who were tough guys not easily spooked, never wanted to go back there again. I'm not going to lie, I didn't either. To this day, I can't explain what happened in Keem's Canyon. Nothing's ever given me chills like that place. Every time I think about it, I picture those claw marks and the huge footprints. I remember that strange, distorted cry and the feeling that we were being examined by something hidden in the shadows. There was this sense of crossing into a territory that didn't belong to us. And then, just like that, it ended. We left, the sounds stopped, and life went back to normal. I still can't say what really lurked out there. I guess I'll never know, but I haven't forgotten any of it. It still keeps me awake some nights, wondering what watched us from the darkness of that canyon. Story 16. I still remember that day in late summer 1979, near Burton Springs, Virginia. Clara and I had planned that trip for weeks, excited by the chance to explore a lesser-known stretch of the Appalachian Trail. We were both young, curious, and eager to find new scenery far from the usual crowded spots. I wasn't prepared for what we found out there. Even now, decades later, it still makes the back of my neck prickle when I think about it. We set out early that morning. Following what we'd heard was a rugged but beautiful section of the trail. The forest there is dense, the rocks and roots jutting out at strange angles, and the ground is often covered in thick layers of damp leaves. It didn't take long for us to notice something was off. Usually in that region, you'd hear plenty of bird calls and the occasional rustle of small critters. Instead, it was silent. I mean really silent. The kind of silence where you become hyper-aware of your own breathing, where every step feels too loud, every twig that snaps under your boot sounds like a gunshot. As we went deeper, I remember thinking how the quiet felt wrong. We could still smell the rich scent of damp earth and old leaves, but that was it. No chirps, no insects buzzing around, nothing. The air was oddly still, like a room just after you've closed all the windows. Clara kept looking around, trying to find a reason for it. I tried to brush it off, telling myself maybe we'd just timed it wrong and the wildlife was elsewhere. But the more steps we took, the more uneasy I felt. After a while, we noticed branches snapped high above our heads. Some were at least 8, maybe 10 feet up. These weren't just small twigs broken by the wind. Thick, solid branches looked twisted and snapped, like someone had taken them in both hands and wrenched them apart. The height alone was baffling. Bears could stand, sure, but these breaks looked strange, like something taller than any normal animal had passed through there. I tried not to panic, but Clara looked more and more uneasy. I could see her eyes darting to the tree line, checking for movement. When she asked if we should turn back, I hesitated. Part of me thought, we came all this way, and maybe it's nothing. Another part of me felt a knot tightening in my stomach. But I said we should keep going a bit longer, just to see if we could reach the overlook we'd heard about. Clara agreed, but she was tense, and I was too. I tried to keep my voice steady and calm, but my mind kept going in circles. We advanced slowly, our boots crunching leaves that sounded too loud in that silence. Every so often I'd turn my head sharply, convinced I'd heard something, just a faint crack, like something stepping back behind a tree. But each time I looked, I saw nothing but trunks, moss, and the dim greenish light filtering through the canopy. At one point, we crossed a small stream, nothing more than a trickle running over smooth stones. As we stood there, I heard something. It was low, guttural, and distant. It sounded like a growl, not a bear's deep rumble, not a cat's snarl, but something in between, quieter, almost controlled. Clara tensed, and I pressed a finger to my lips. We waited, every muscle in my body tight, listening. Nothing. It was gone as quickly as it came, but from that moment I knew we were not alone. The tension was suffocating. We kept moving more quickly now, no longer talking about reaching the overlook. We just wanted to find a sign of other hikers, maybe a familiar marker, something to prove we weren't stumbling into a trap set by nature itself. That's when we found the footprints, or rather, the weird impressions in the damp soil. They were large, bigger than any human foot I'd ever seen, and they weren't shaped like a boot. They looked almost like a bare footprint, but elongated, with a strange outline that didn't match any animal track I knew. I crouched down, running my finger along the edge of one track. The soil was still soft, the edges not fully filled in by water. Whatever made it had passed through recently. At that point, every hair on my body stood up. It was like my instincts were screaming at me that we shouldn't be there. Clara's eyes were wide, and I could see the tears welling up. She whispered that we should leave, that this was a bad place. I didn't argue. We turned around and started heading back the way we came, trying to retrace our steps. That walk back felt endless. Every time a twig snapped or a leaf rustled, we stopped dead, scanning the trees. The silence was still there, but now it felt like something was holding its breath along with us. The only time we heard anything from above was a sudden, sharp crack of a branch somewhere in the distance, like a warning shot. It echoed in the hollow quiet, and I swear my heart nearly jumped out of my chest. I kept expecting to see something, just a shape, a flash of fur, anything. But there was nothing, only that sense of being watched. It's the worst feeling, knowing something could be right there behind a trunk or a boulder, just waiting for you to make a mistake. At one point, Clara stumbled, and my heart sank, but she scrambled up quickly, and we hurried on. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but I was shaking. My palms were sweaty, my pulse pounding in my ears. Eventually, we saw a familiar bend in the trail, a place where a large fallen tree formed a natural bench by the path. I'd noticed it that morning. That was when I realized we were finally getting closer to the more popular section of the trail. We rushed forward, and my relief was almost dizzying. Right after that bend, we saw another hiker, a guy I didn't know, packing up his gear by a small clearing. The sight of another human being felt like a lifeline. He looked startled by our sudden appearance. We probably looked like we'd seen a ghost. He asked if we were okay, and I managed to say something about weird noises and feeling like we were being followed. He frowned, then mentioned he'd heard screams the previous night, far off in the woods. He thought maybe it was an animal in distress, but he wasn't sure. That just confirmed my feeling that something was out there, something we couldn't explain, and I didn't want to stick around to find out more. We decided all together that it wasn't worth going any deeper into the trail. We headed back toward Burton Springs, walking quickly, watching the forest edge. Once in town, we reported what we'd experienced to the forest ranger. We described the footprints, the silence, the sense of being watched, the strange sounds. They took notes and assured us they'd look into it. But nothing ever came of it, or at least nothing I ever heard about. No official explanation, no big headlines. Just a few quiet rumors passed around the locals, a sense of something lurking in those woods that didn't belong there. I never got any kind of closure. Clara and I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear with an odd gait, or some drifter out there trying to scare people off. But deep down, neither of us believed that. Something else was in those woods in 1979, something that left no clear proof, just a lingering feeling of dread. We never went back to that section of the trail, and to this day, I still avoid going deep into unfamiliar forests alone. What happened out there was brief, intense, and impossible to shake. It ended as abruptly as it began. One moment we were pressed against the trees, feeling like prey, and the next we were stumbling back into the relative safety of a known path, finding another human face and returning to town. The forest didn't offer any explanations then, and it never has. Even now, all these years later, when I think of that day, my mind draws a blank for any logical answer. It just leaves me with a memory of thick silence, impossible footprints, and the terrifying suspicion that something huge and unseen walked those woods beside us. That's all I've got. No final twist, no neat conclusion, just the uneasy certainty that we encountered something we were never meant to see. Story 17. I know this is going to sound crazy. I've never really talked about it publicly before because I'm still not sure how much I believe my own memory. But I've been thinking a lot about what happened to me back in 1977, near that old abandoned amusement park outside Greenock, Ohio. It's been decades, and I still don't have a solid explanation. I figure I might as well share it here, see if anyone else ever heard of something similar. I was working as a private investigator back then, hired by some guy who claimed his grandfather had disappeared around that area when the park was still operating. There were old rumors, people disappearing, kids vanishing, strange sightings of something lurking among those old rides. I wasn't sure what to believe. At the time, I chalked it up to local myths and small-town gossip, but I was getting paid, so I went. It was a cloudy, grey afternoon when I arrived. The place was surrounded by tall, unkempt weeds, chain-link fences with gaps torn open, and rusted signs that used to advertise cotton candy and carnival games. The whole scene had that heavy, stale smell like old dust trapped in a basement for too long. I remember how quiet it was. No birds, no wind, just a kind of thick silence that somehow pressed down on me. I felt uneasy the moment I stepped through that broken fence. Inside, the old rides were frozen in time. The Ferris wheel stood crooked and still, its metal frame rusted, one of the carts dangling at an odd angle. There were a few half-collapsed booths where they used to sell food and tickets. The paint was peeling off in thick flakes. Every step I took kicked up a thin layer of dust that settled slowly, as if time barely moved in there. I remember bending down near one of the booths and noticing something caught in the old wooden planks, a strip of fabric, torn and faded. It looked like part of someone's clothing. Nearby, buried under debris, I found more torn fabric, and then something else that made me feel sick. Broken bones. Not animal bones. These looked human. They were scattered around, mixed with scraps of cloth and old pieces of paper. It didn't look staged. It looked authentic. Whatever happened there was violent. I could almost feel it lingering in the air. I tried to keep my composure. After all, I was supposed to be investigating. But the quiet made every sound stand out. I could hear the boards creaking under my shoes, and every time something shifted in the distance, some old piece of metal settling, it made my heart jump. I headed deeper into the park, past a row of abandoned stands. I didn't have any cell phone back then. Nobody did. Just a flashlight, a notepad, and a small camera. But that day I remember the flashlight started flickering as I passed by these strange claw marks in the wooden posts near where the carousel used to spin. The marks were deep, like something with powerful arms and hands had ripped into the wood. It didn't look like any tool mark I'd seen, and I'd seen a fair share of vandalism in my line of work. The air felt thicker as I approached the old administrative office, a small building with boarded-up windows. I pried open a door that was barely hanging on its hinges and stepped inside. The smell hit me immediately. Old paper, mold, and something else underneath like rancid meat. It was hard to stay calm. I rummaged through what was left, filing cabinets, old ledgers and folders. Most documents were too damaged, covered in mildew. But I found a set of handwritten notes crammed into a dusty drawer. A few sentences jumped out at me. Seen it again last night. Too tall to be a man. Covered in hair. Smelled like something rotten. These weren't official reports. They looked like personal notes, maybe from an employee who'd worked late shifts. They sounded terrified. Whoever wrote them must have thought they were losing their mind. I felt a chill run down my spine while reading these. I was in that exact place, alone, and now I knew someone else had encountered something here, something they couldn't explain. Suddenly I heard a noise outside. It was heavy, like a large branch snapping under weight, but there were no trees close enough to break like that. I froze, switched off my flashlight, and listened. There was a faint shuffling sound, and then a soft grunt, almost like a muffled bark or growl. It didn't sound like a person. It sounded deeper, heavier, like an animal twice the size of any I'd expect to find there. I moved to the shattered window and peeked out, careful not to make a sound. The park's main area was just visible through the broken glass. For a few seconds, I saw nothing. Then something big moved between the rusted metal beams that once held up a ride. It was tall, definitely taller than any person I'd seen, and I could make out what looked like dark, matted hair hanging off its frame. The thing stepped into a patch of light. What little light came through the clouds, and I caught a glimpse of its face. At least, I think I did. It turned slightly, and I saw a profile. Broad head, a kind of flat nose and sunken eyes that seemed to catch the dim light in a strange way. It didn't look human. It looked more like a massive ape, but hunched, wary, sniffing the air. Its shoulders were huge, arms long. I swear to you, it moved with a kind of cautious intelligence. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it. I was stuck inside this old building, with who knows what outside. I tried to think logically. Maybe it was a bear with a weird posture, maybe a prankster in a suit, though why would anyone do that in this deserted place? Or maybe something else entirely. I didn't have the luxury to stand around debating what it was. I turned and made my way towards a back door I'd noticed earlier, trying to be as quiet as humanly possible. Every step felt like it could betray me, every loose nail, every cracked floorboard. Outside I kept hearing faint movement, a shifting of weight, and once what sounded like a low grunt again. It was circling around, or at least it felt that way. I remember holding my breath for so long my chest hurt. When I finally reached the door, it creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The sound echoed and I tensed, waiting for something to charge at me. Nothing happened right away, so I stepped out into the open, behind the office building. The parking lot was on the other side, but I had to pass through a narrow walkway blocked by broken fences and twisted metal. As I started to move along that path, I heard heavy footsteps behind me. Not running, just following. Each step came with a dull thud, like something big padding slowly on the ground, almost careful not to make too much noise. I couldn't bring myself to look back. I was too scared that if I looked and confirmed it was there, I might panic and lose it completely. So I just kept moving, quietly, bit by bit, trying not to trip over debris. The sky was getting dimmer, the afternoon light fading. The air had this chill now, and the smell, like wet fur and decaying leaves, kept drifting toward me. There was a strange silence again. That absolute quiet is something I'll never forget. It's like the world just held its breath. When I finally reached the edge of the park, near where I'd left my car, I took a chance and looked over my shoulder. I saw nothing at first, but then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw something move behind one of the old rides, just a glimpse of fur and a massive limb pulling back behind the iron frame. I have no idea if it was trying to hide or if it just didn't care to show itself completely. That's when I sprinted to my car. I didn't care about noise anymore. I just ran, my legs shaking like jelly, half expecting it to come barreling after me. It never did. I jumped in, turned the ignition, and peeled out of there. As I sped away, I kept checking my rearview mirror. Nothing followed me onto the road. No shape emerged from the bushes. The place stayed quiet and still, fading into the dusk. I can't explain it, but I felt like whatever lived there just let me go. Maybe it was used to scaring people off, or maybe it didn't consider me enough of a threat or a meal. I don't know. I tried telling a few people in town afterwards, but no one believed me. They thought I'd gotten spooked by shadows, maybe found some old animal remains, and cooked up a scary story in my head. The authorities weren't interested. They considered it a run-down property not worth their time. And I had no hard proof, no pictures, no physical evidence, just my word. It's not like I could have grabbed a memento from a creature like that. The only evidence I had was how shaken I was and how I couldn't sleep right for weeks. I know this story sounds ridiculous, but to this day I remember every detail, especially the smell and the silence. I remember the feeling that there was something out there that shouldn't exist, something that's not supposed to be part of our world. That abandoned park was hiding a secret, and I stumbled right into it. I'm not saying I saw Bigfoot or anything by name. I'm just saying I saw something impossible, something huge and intelligent and dangerous, lingering around those rusted rides and broken booths. After that, I never went back. I quit that particular case and returned the fee to my client. I told him I couldn't find any conclusive evidence and that it was too dangerous to continue. I never went into specifics. He probably thought I was incompetent. That's fine. I'd rather be thought of as incompetent than risk my life going back there. I still think about it sometimes. I wonder what it was doing there, and if it's still around, or if it moved on to some other remote spot. The disappearances from decades ago, maybe they weren't just rumors. Maybe people really got taken by something we still don't understand. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but that's what happened. And after all these years, I still can't come up with a better explanation for what I saw and heard that day in that old abandoned amusement park. I guess I'll never know. It happened, it ended, and no matter how many times I turn it over in my mind, I can't explain it. It's just one of those things I'll carry with me until I'm gone. Story 18. I remember it so clearly, even though it's been decades. It was back in 1990, not too far from Harristown, Wisconsin, right by that isolated place everyone called Lake Pig. The name always sounded odd, but that lake had a reputation, and I'd been there before. I didn't go alone this time. I had Ayla with me. We had planned this out for weeks, thinking we'd finally gather something concrete, audio, maybe a few photos, footprints, anything that would prove what was out there. We weren't expecting a peaceful camping trip. We wanted evidence. I remember the way the late afternoon light hit the lake. The surface had this golden sheen that looked almost calm and welcoming, but there was this thick silence all around us. It's hard to explain unless you've been in a place like that. The trees, mostly tall pines, just stood there like dark silhouettes, and the only thing I could really hear was the faint whisper of the wind against the branches. Otherwise, it was dead quiet. We set up our tent and gear on a small clearing near the shore. Our equipment wasn't anything fancy by today's standards, but at the time, we had what we thought was pretty high-end stuff. An old video camera, a decent microphone, some strong lanterns, and a portable recorder. We thought we were prepared. As evening settled in, we tried to distract ourselves by making dinner. Just instant noodles and some canned beans. Nothing special. That's when Allah said he saw something move near the bushes. I didn't catch it, but he froze for a second, then quietly told me to look over there. I turned and tried to focus on where he was pointing. I even positioned the camera, zooming in on that spot. But all I saw were branches and leaves that barely moved. Nothing unusual. Maybe just a trick of the light, I thought. But Allah looked unsettled. He's not the kind of guy to scare easily. Night came on fast. Out there, once the sun dips below the horizon, it gets dark, really dark. Our lanterns cut through some of it, but we were basically relying on small circles of light in a sea of black. I started hearing these weird, muffled thuds off in the distance. They could have been footsteps. They had this heavy rhythm to them, like something large pacing just beyond our sight. It got under my skin. My nerves started to rise, and I remember sniffing the air and catching a strange scent. It was like damp earth mixed with something rotten, as if an animal had died nearby and started decaying. That smell just hung there, faint but persistent. Allaire and I decided to check the perimeter. We grabbed the lanterns and began to slowly walk around our campsite. The ground near the lake's edge was a bit damp, and we could see where our boots left impressions in the mud. That's when we noticed other tracks, deep, elongated footprints, longer than any human foot and pressed hard into the wet soil. They weren't bear prints. I've seen bear prints before, and these were different. They seemed more human-like, but way too big and too spread out. I tried to measure one with my boot. It easily dwarfed it. And the stride was long. Whatever made these tracks had a massive step. That's when the realization that something was definitely there hit me hard. It wasn't just stories or rumors this time. It wasn't just my imagination playing tricks. I was seeing real evidence in front of my face. But Ayla and I were alone, in the dark, with no cell service. Not that it was really common back then, and no one to call for help. We didn't even have a radio that could reach anyone in town. All we had were flashlights, a camera, and a knife or two. Not exactly comforting. The wind picked up for a moment, rustling the pines, and the noise they made was unsettling. It sounded like whispers or hushed voices. I tried to rationalize it, probably just the wind, maybe some small animal skirting around. But the feeling of being watched was intense. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel my pulse in my ears. At some point, we heard snapping sounds, like twigs breaking under weight. Allah whipped his lantern towards the sound, and I followed suit, but we saw nothing. Just darkness and the outlines of tree trunks. It was like something was smart enough to stay hidden right outside our range of vision. Every time we turned, it felt like it circled behind us. We were being toyed with, or at least that's how it felt. I kept thinking that maybe we should pack up and leave, but leaving at night would mean stumbling through thick woods, trying to find our way back without a clear trail. The lake was not a friendly route either, pitch-black water and no guarantee we could outrun whatever this was. So we stayed, adrenaline pumping, forcing ourselves to hold our ground. Around midnight, could have been a bit later, I heard this low, guttural sound. It wasn't a growl like a bear or a cougar. It was deeper, almost like a moan, but more aggressive, like a warning. Allah heard it too. We shot each other a look, both of us pale. My chest tightened up. I was scared, truly scared, thinking that we might get charged at any second. I can't even describe the tension. We were silent, not daring to move or make noise. The only thing I did was slowly reach for the video camera, hoping maybe I could catch a glimpse. But when I lifted it, the sound stopped. No movement, no shadows, just that unnerving quiet again. Time crawled by. We didn't sleep. We stayed near the tent, lanterns on, scanning the surroundings. The smell of something rotten drifted by again, stronger this time, making me want to gag. I listened carefully and noticed there were no normal forest sounds, no crickets, no distant owl calls, nothing. That's what really freaked me out. The forest seemed to be holding its breath. As the night dragged on, I became more convinced that we weren't dealing with some ordinary animal. I'd heard rumors about strange sightings around Lake Pig. Some people claimed they saw something like a giant ape-man, a Bigfoot-like creature that vanished into the trees. I never put much stock in those stories. I was there for proof, but secretly, I never expected to see anything too dramatic. Now I was sitting in total darkness, certain that something big and very real was out there, watching us, maybe stalking us. It must have been early morning, maybe 4 or 5 a.m., when we heard a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. It was a roar, but not like any animal I know. It sounded like a combination of a scream and a roar, echoing through the pines. It wasn't far either. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I just stood there, stunned. Allah looked like he was about to bolt, and I don't blame him. We grabbed our gear and pulled it closer, ready to leave if we had to. But then it stopped again. Nothing followed. No charge, no rush of movement, just the echo fading away. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, each of us clutching a lantern and trying to stay alert. I tried to record sounds, but I'm not sure I got anything clear. Eventually, the first weak light of dawn began to show. The relief I felt seeing that pale glow is hard to describe. With the daylight, I felt a tiny bit safer. Not safe, but safer. As soon as we had enough light to see more than a few feet ahead, we started checking around. We found more tracks. They were fresh, pressed into soft patches of forest floor. We found scratch marks on some of the tree trunks, long and deep, as if something with powerful hands had raked them. We even found some coarse, dark hair snagged on a lower branch. I collected it. It smelled awful, like wet dog fur times 10. I stored it carefully in a plastic bag, thinking I'd show it to someone who knew about wildlife. With the sun fully up, we decided to pack up and leave. The place didn't feel calm or beautiful anymore. It felt sinister. I couldn't wait to get out of there. We hurried back to town, our nerves still raw. Once in Harristown, We approached some local authorities, rangers and a county official, trying to explain what we'd found. They examined the hair and the plaster cast we made of one of the footprints. I could tell they were skeptical, though. They just nodded, said it might be some known animal's hair, that the footprint could be distorted by the way the mud settled. We didn't get any official acknowledgement, nothing to say. Yes, there's something strange out there. We never got a clear look at it. I never saw a face, never spotted eyes glowing at me from the darkness. But the evidence was enough for me and for Ayla. We knew something big was roaming near Lake Pig. It was strong, it was smart, and it wanted us to know it was there. After that night, I didn't really care about what people believed. I knew what I'd heard, what I'd smelled, what I'd seen. I still think about that roar. I still remember that awful silence, the feeling of being cornered by something invisible, but very real. Over the years, whenever I've told this story, some people laugh. Some say I must have been half asleep, or that I let my imagination get the best of me. But I know the truth. Something's out there, and it's not just a rumor. If I think about it too long, I still get chills. The lake is still there, surrounded by those pines, and whatever made those prints could still be lurking, just as invisible, just as quiet, waiting for the next curious person to show up and try to prove it's real. It never gave me a grand finale or a neat conclusion. It never showed itself in a way that I could say, here it is, here's the proof. It simply let us know we were not alone, then went silent, leaving me with nothing but memories and a bag of dark hair that never convinced anyone. That's the part that haunts me. I can't explain it, and I guess I never will. Story 19. I was living at the old Henderson farm near Clearwater, Montana, in the summer of 1983. I remember that day too clearly. I wish I could forget it, but I can't. The place looked so ordinary if you didn't know its history. Gentle hills rolling off into the distance, tall grass that hid all sorts of tiny critters, and that old wooden barn, always creaking, even when there was no wind. It was just after sunset, still light enough to see the outlines of everything, but the sky was bruising dark. I'd been on that farm for a while, trying to understand the odd things that people used to whisper about it. There were these old stories in town. Most folks brushed them off, said it was nonsense. I'm not so sure anymore. As the evening settled in, I noticed the animals acting strange. The chickens, which usually wandered around without a care, were huddled together in the coop, clucking nervously. The dog, a gentle mutt who'd never given me trouble, refused to leave the porch. He just stared out toward the fields behind the barn, ears down, trembling. I'd never seen him like that. It was like he knew something was out there, something he wanted no part of. I tried to calm myself by walking the perimeter of the property. I saw these weird footprints in the dirt near the barn. They were large, much larger than any humans, and the placement was off, like they weren't shaped right, or maybe something with a strange gait had passed through. They were deep, too, as if whatever made them was heavy, and I swear, the grass in certain spots looked flattened, as if something had been crouching there. I got a feeling in my gut that I wasn't alone, even though I couldn't see anyone. The air had that metallic smell, almost like old blood or rusty iron, but I couldn't find its source. The sun sank lower, and the sky turned black. I went inside, locked up the doors and windows, and kept the lights low. I had no idea what I was dealing with, so I thought it best not to draw attention. A short time later, Esther, my neighbor from down the road, showed up. She had brought an old shotgun and some heavy-duty flashlights. She'd heard stories too and said she had her own reasons for being jumpy about this place. We agreed we'd keep watch from the porch that night. We didn't really talk much, just nodded, got ourselves settled, and sat there in the dark. There was almost no sound. No crickets, no owls, not even the wind making that old barn door squeak. It was as if every living thing knew to stay quiet. Around midnight, the moon was high and bright, and it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. More time passed, and nothing happened. Part of me wanted to relax, think maybe it was all in my head. But I stayed tense, gripping my flashlight, eyes scanning the yard, the fields, the barn. Then, around 2 in the morning, I heard it. There was this dragging sound, like something heavy scraping against the wooden barn wall. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my ears. Esther tensed up too. We looked at each other, and I could see in her eyes that she was scared, but determined. We slowly got up and moved off the porch, flashlights off to keep from giving ourselves away. The dog whimpered inside the house. We crept toward the barn, careful not to make noise. I could hear my boots crunching softly in the dirt and tried to step lighter. When we were about 15 feet away, we flicked on the flashlights. The barn door was ajar, just slightly. I remember thinking I'd closed it tight. I should have locked it. Inside, I could smell that metallic odor again, stronger now. It reminded me of blood, but I didn't see any. Just old hay and some tools hanging on the walls. We stepped inside, one at a time, scanning every corner with the beams of light. The flashlight caught these large footprints in the loose dirt on the barn floor. They looked fresh and led to a dark corner behind a stack of old crates. The smell was almost unbearable back there, rank, animal-like, but not like any animal I'd smelled before. I crouched down to see if there was anything else, when suddenly this deep, guttural growl filled the space. It didn't sound like a bear or a wolf. It was different, maybe larger, stranger, rough, like it came from a huge chest. My blood went cold. I aimed the flashlight toward the noise, but all I saw was movement, something big shifting in the darkness. Before I could process what was happening, Esther fired her shotgun into the air. The sound echoed in that barn, making my ears ring. Whatever it was let out a startled grunt and bolted. I saw this tall, broad shape lurch into motion, moving faster than I'd think something that big could move. It shoved past the crates, out the back of the barn, making the wood frame rattle. The noise it made as it escaped sounded like heavy steps pounding the ground, then fading away into the fields. We rushed outside and pointed our flashlights, trying to catch a glimpse. For a split second, I saw it at the edge of the property, tall, covered in dark hair or fur, blending with the night but definitely not human. It looked over its shoulder, and even from that distance I could feel it watching us. Then it slipped over the hill, gone as if it had never been there at all. I've hunted game before. I've seen big animals run off into the woods, but this was different. It moved like it knew the land better than I did, vanishing without a sound. My heart was still hammering, and I realized I was shaking. Esther looked just as stunned. We considered following it for a split second, but that was a stupid idea. We were in the dark, with one shotgun and flashlights. Whatever it was had already shown it could get close to us without us even noticing until it wanted us to. Chasing it into the darkness seemed like a death wish. We went back to the porch, still trying to wrap our heads around what we'd just seen. The dog was hiding under a chair, whining softly. I was relieved we hadn't been attacked. Whatever it was, it could have done a lot of damage. The footprints, the smell, the noises, all of it was proof something had been there. But I knew that if I tried explaining this to anyone the next day, I'd just get those looks. People would say we were spooked by a bear or maybe some vagrant. But I know what bears look like, and that wasn't a bear. And no person I've ever seen has footprints like that or smells like that. It had an animal strength, but there was something else there, something I can't name. It felt intelligent, like it knew exactly when to appear and when to vanish. The next morning I reported it anyway. The sheriff and a deputy came out, looked around, shrugged it off. They saw footprints, but they were smudged and strange. They said maybe it was just a trick of the light, or something washed out by the morning dew. They didn't find any blood or fur samples, just us, a shaken man and a neighbor with a shotgun. They didn't laugh at me, but they didn't really believe me either. I heard a few folks in town whisper about old stories, about a thing in the hills that people claimed to see sometimes when they were kids. Some said it was a legend, some kind of creature that lived in the area for generations. Others brushed it off as old tales, meant to scare children. But now, I can't help thinking those stories are rooted in something real. After that night, I reinforced the barn doors. I kept the dog inside after sunset. Esther and I decided we weren't going anywhere, though. I know how that sounds, but I guess some twisted curiosity kept me there. It was like being stuck in a strange dance with whatever lurked out there. I didn't have any illusions about making friends with it, but I wanted to understand it, to figure out what it was and what it wanted. Yet the nights passed, and aside from a few distant noises and the occasional strange footprint, we never got another clear look. Over time, the fear and adrenaline faded, but the memory never left. I still think back to that night, the smell, the growl, the size of that shape. I wonder if it was watching us even before we realized it. I wonder if it's still out there, behind those hills, staying just out of sight. The Henderson farm looks calm and quiet to anyone who passes by. If you drove through, you'd never guess what we saw. But I know. Esther knows. The animals knew. There's something out there that doesn't belong in our understanding of this place. I've long since given up trying to explain it in a way that makes sense. I don't have any neat ending to the story. It happened, and then it stopped. That's it. The creature came and went, left us rattled and uncertain. I still live with that uncertainty, still look toward those hills at dusk, and wonder if it might come back. Over the years, I've learned that some things don't fit nicely into what we think we know. The old Henderson farm remains what it's always been, a quiet piece of land in Montana, holding secrets that I can't begin to unravel. And I'm stuck holding this memory, forever unsure, forever uneasy.